I will not be swayed by ornate steel.
It is not the steel, my king, but the hand that wields it.
Imagine Rome at night. The clamor of the day has faded, replaced by the whisper of a cool breeze through silent marble halls. Lamplight flickers across intricate mosaics, casting long, dancing shadows. In the heart of the Palatine Hill, within the sprawling imperial palace, a lone figure stands, silhouetted against a moonlit window. This is the emperor, but not one you might easily recognize from the grand statues or triumphant arches. This is Domitian, the last of the Flavian dynasty, a ruler often painted as a tyrant, a monster of paranoia and cruelty. But what if history, as it's so often written by the victors, has only told us one side of the story? What if, behind the terrifying persona, there was a man of complex contradictions, a man whose reign, while drenched in fear, also brought about an era of stability and efficiency that the Roman Empire desperately needed? He was a micromanager, an architect of order, a poet at heart, and a deeply insecure soul who saw enemies in every shadow. His story isn't a simple tale of good versus evil. It's a gripping psychological drama, a paradox of discipline and paranoia, of public works and private terrors. Tonight, we step past the sensational accounts of hostile senators and biased historians. We venture into the shadows of the palace to uncover the truth about the emperor who ruled from them. We will explore the man who consolidated Roman power, who fortified its borders, and who rebuilt Rome from the ashes of civil war, all while battling the demons within his own mind. Was he truly the monster history remembers, or was he a victim of his own success, a misunderstood ruler whose efficiency bred fear and whose fear ultimately led to his downfall? Join me as we unravel the enigma of Domitian, the emperor in the shadows. We'll examine his early life, overshadowed by his famous father, Vespasian, and his beloved brother, Titus. We'll look at the world he inherited of Rome, scarred by the decadent chaos of Nero and the brutal year of the four emperors. This context is crucial because no ruler emerges from a vacuum. Domitian's iron fist was forged in the fires of instability. His obsession with control wasn't born from simple malice. It was a direct reaction to the world he saw crumbling around him. From a young age, Domitian was the spare, not the heir. While his father and brother were winning military glory in Judea, he was left behind in Rome, a political pawn during a civil war. He survived betrayals and near-death experiences, learning early and brutal lessons about the nature of power. These formative years instilled in him a deep-seated suspicion of the senatorial elite, a class he believed was fickle, self-serving, and always plotting. This wasn't just paranoia. It was an observation based on lived experience. When he finally ascended to the throne after the unexpected death of his brother Titus, he was determined not to be a mere figure. He intended to rule, and to rule absolutely. He called himself Dominus et Deus, Master and God. To our modern ears, this sounds like the height of arrogance, and perhaps it was. But in the context of Roman imperial ideology, it was also a statement of intent, a declaration that the chaotic, backstabbing politics of the old republic were over. One divine will would now guide the state, ensuring order and justice for all, not just the privileged few. And for a time, it worked. Domitian was a masterful administrator. He took a keen personal interest in the governance of the provinces, appointing competent officials and ruthlessly prosecuting corruption. He stabilized the empire's currency, which had been in decline for decades, ensuring economic security. He embarked on a massive building program, restoring temples and public buildings destroyed by fire and constructing new landmarks, like the magnificent Flavian Palace on the Palatine Hill and the stadium that would one day become the Piazza. For the average Roman citizen, life under Domitian was predictable and secure. The grain supply was reliable, the streets were safer, and the law was, for the most part, applied fairly. His military policy was equally pragmatic. Instead of embarking on risky wars of expansion like Trajan after him, Domitian focused on consolidating and strengthening the empire's existing frontiers. He campaigned personally on the Rhine and Danube rivers, not for glory, but to create a stable, defensible border against Germanic and Dacian tribes. He raised the pay of the legionaries, ensuring their loyalty not to their generals, but to the emperor himself a crucial lesson learned from the civil wars. In Manuales, he laid the groundwork for the long period of peace and prosperity that would follow his reign, the era we now call the Pax Romana. But this efficiency came at a terrible cost, especially for those closest to power. Domitian's court was a place of suffocating tension. He trusted no one. He used a network of informers, the dreaded Delatoris asterisk, to root out dissent among the senators and equestrian class. Treason trials became commonplace, often based on flimsy evidence or whispered accusations. Executions and confiscations of property followed, filling the imperial treasury and eliminating potential rivals. He lived in constant fear of assassination, reportedly lining the walls of his porticos with highly polished stone so he could see who might be sneaking up behind him. This is the paradox of Domitian. He was an emperor who brought order to the streets of Rome, but lived in personal chaos. He demanded absolute loyalty, but trusted no one. He championed justice for the common people, but unleashed terror upon the elite. Was his paranoia justified? Perhaps. The Roman Senate had a long history of assassinating emperors they disliked, but Domitian's methods created a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more he cracked down, the more he alienated the very people whose cooperation he needed, and the more conspiracies, real or imagined, began to swirl. His relationship with the philosophers and writers of his time was equally fraught. He saw their independent thinking as a threat, banishing many from Rome. This act had a profound impact on how he would be remembered. The historians who wrote the primary accounts of his reign, like Titus and Pliny the Younger, were members of the very senatorial class. They wrote with the bitter ink of personal animosity, portraying him as an unmitigated despot. They downplayed his administrative successes and magnified his personal cruelties, creating the portrait of the monster that has dominated history for 2 millennia. They wrote the history, and they wrote him out of its glories. In the end, his fear became his reality. A conspiracy, born within the claustrophobic confines of his own palace, finally succeeded. It wasn't senators and the curia, but his own staff stewards, secretaries, even his wife. Domitia Longina was implicated, who planned his demise. They were the people who lived daily with his suspicion and volatile temper. On September 18th, 96 AD, he was cornered and stabbed to death in his own bedroom. It was a brutal, intimate end for an emperor who had tried to keep the world at arm's length. Immediately after his death, the Senate rejoiced. De passeda por damnatio memoria. Condemning his memory, his statues were torn down. His name was chiseled from inscriptions, and his acts were officially nullified. It was an attempt to erase him from history completely, but you cannot erase a 15-year reign. You cannot erase the roads, the aqueducts, the stabilized borders, or the administrative reforms. You can only distort the memory of the men behind them. So, we are left with a ghost of Domitian, a ruler too effective to be ignored, but too terrifying to be loved. Was he a necessary evil? An autocrat, whose heavy hand was required to steer the Roman state through troubled waters? Or was he simply a paranoid tyrant who let his personal demons consume him and his empire? The truth, as it so often is, likely lies somewhere in the murky depths between those two extremes. His story serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a set of facts, but a narrative shaped by the biases and motives of those who write it. To understand Domitian, we have to look past the narrative and into the shadows where he lived and ruled. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the complex world of ancient Rome. If you found this exploration fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of history. Let me know in the comments, what do you think about Domitian, tyrant or misunderstood genius? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay curious. Ever wondered how an ordinary family could seize control of the most powerful empire in the world? Today, we're diving into the incredible story of the Flavians, a family that clawed their way from obscurity to the very pinnacle of Roman power. This isn't just a tale of emperors. It's a saga of ambition, war, and a dynasty forged in the fires of chaos. Our story begins not in a grand palace, but with a man named Vespasian. Forget the patrician elite with centuries of noble lineage. Vespasian was a new man, hailing from the equestrian class. Think of them as the hard-working, upper-middle class of Rome. His family were tax collectors and bankers, practical people, not aristocrats born with a silver spoon. Vespasian was a soldier's soldier, tough, pragmatic, and respected by the legions. He spent his career climbing the military and political ladder, not through inherited privilege, but through sheer competence and grit. On the frontiers of the empire, he had two sons who would inherit his ambition: Titus and Domitian. Titus, the elder, was the golden boy, handsome, charismatic, and a skilled commander in his own right. He was his father's right-hand man. He was groomed for power, learning the art of war and politics at Vespasian's side. Then there was Domitian, the younger son. Often overshadowed by his father and brother, he spent his youth in Rome, away from the military camps. He was intelligent and capable, but he developed a reputation for being more solitary and perhaps a little resentful of the spotlight that always seemed to shine on Titus. The stage 4, their dramatic rise, was set by one of Rome's most infamous emperors, Nero. His reign ended in a spectacular collapse, plunging the empire into a period of sheer anarchy known as the Year of the Four Emperors in 69. Rome was a revolving door of would-be rulers. Galba, Otho Vitellius, one after another. Generals backed by their legions marched on Rome, seized power, and were just as quickly overthrown and killed. The empire was bleeding, tearing itself apart in a brutal civil war. The Senate was powerless. The people of Rome were terrified, and the very foundations of the Roman world seemed to be crumbling. While this chaos engulfed the capital, Vespasian was far away in the east, commanding the legions tasked with crushing a major revolt in Judea. He and his son Titus were seasoned generals with a powerful loyalty at their backs. As news of the spiraling crisis in Rome reached them, the soldiers in the eastern provinces began to look at their own commander. They saw a man who was stable, experienced, and capable of restoring order. Vitellius, the emperor currently holding Rome, was seen as gluttonous and ineffective. The legions in the east had a better idea. In July of 69 AD, the legions in Egypt, and then his own troops in Judea, proclaimed Vespasian emperor. This was it, the ultimate gamble. He wasn't just a general anymore. He was a contender for the throne. Leaving Titus to finish the campaign in Judea, Vespasian secured control of Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome. This was a brilliant strategic move. By cutting off the grain supply, he could starve the capital into submission without even setting foot in Italy. Meanwhile, his allies in the Balkans marched on Italy. The decisive battle took place at Cremona, a brutal and bloody affair where Vespasian's forces defeated the armies loyal to Vitellius. The path to Rome was open. When Vespasian's troops entered the city, Vitellius was dragged from his hiding place and brutally killed, his body thrown into the Tiber River. After a year of bloodshed and instability, Rome finally had a new master. When Vespasian arrived in Rome in 70 AD, he was a breath of fresh air. He wasn't a spoiled aristocrat or a power-hungry general who had stumbled into the role. He was a 60-year-old veteran who understood finance, the military, and the importance of stability. His first priority was to heal the empire. He launched a massive building program, the most famous project being the Flavian amphitheater. What we now know as the Colosseum, it was built on the site of Nero's extravagant private lake, a powerful symbol of returning land to the people of Rome. He stabilized the state's finances, which were in ruins after Nero's excesses and the Civil War, famously introducing new taxes, including one on public urine, leading to the phrase, "money does not stink." Vespasian's reign was about pragmatism. He worked with the Senate, reformed the army, and secured the frontiers. He established a clear line of succession, making it plain that his sons, Titus and then Domitian, would follow him. He was founding a dynasty, not just winning a war. He wanted to ensure that the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors would never happen again. When Vespasian died of natural causes in 79 AD, a rare feat for a Roman emperor, he famously joked on his deathbed, "Vi, puto Deus. Fio," which means, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." It was a perfect summary of his down-to-earth, witty character. power hadn't corrupted him. He remained the practical soldier to the very end. Titus, the beloved son, took the throne seamlessly. His reign is often remembered as a golden age, though it was tragically short and marked by disaster. Just 2 months after he became emperor, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. The following year, a great fire ravaged Rome for 3 days, followed by a terrible plague. Titus responded to each crisis with immense generosity and personal commitment, earning him the title Delight of Mankind. He dedicated the Colosseum, providing 100 days of spectacular games for the people, cementing the Flavian legacy of public works and entertainment. But Titus's reign lasted only 2 years. He died of a fever in 81 AD, leaving the empire to his younger brother, the one who had always been in the shadows, Domitian. And with Domitian's rise, the character of the Flavian dynasty would change dramatically, setting the stage for a very different and much darker chapter in Roman history. So, from humble beginnings through the crucible of civil war, the Flavians had seized the ultimate prize. Vespasian, the pragmatic soldier, had restored order from chaos. Titus, the beloved son, had won the hearts of the people. But now, with the throne passing to the enigmatic and ambitious Domitian, the stability that Vespasian had worked so hard to build would be put to the ultimate test. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the rise and fall of great empires, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because our next chapter on the controversial reign of Domitian is one you won't want to miss. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Flavians. Last time, we witnessed Vespasian's incredible rise from humble beginnings to the most powerful man in Rome. But as one star rises, another often finds itself cast in the shadows. Today, we delve into the early life of Vespasian's younger son, Titus Flavius Domitianus, a figure whose youth was defined by the towering presence of his father and, even more so, his older brother, Titus. This isn't just a story about a prince in waiting. It's a story about ambition, intelligence, and the quiet, simmering resentment of being the second son. Picture Rome in the year 51 AD. The city is a whirlwind of Julio-Claudian drama under Emperor Claudius. It's into this world that Domitian is born, not in a grand palace, but in a modest house on a street named after a pomegranate. His father, Vespasian, was a capable general and politician, but the family was still very much part of the new money elite, not the ancient aristocracy. From the very beginning, Domitian's life was different from his brother Titus's, who was a full decade older. This 10-year age gap was more than just a number. It was a chasm. While Titus was coming of age, training alongside future emperors, and making a name for himself in military campaigns, Domitian was still a child. He was left behind in Rome with his mother, Flavia Domitilla, and his uncle Sabinus, while his father and brother were off winning glory and building the family's reputation in places like Britain and Germania. Imagine being a young boy, hearing tales of your heroic father and brother, seeing their prestige grow, while you're stuck in the city, an observer rather than a participant. Titus was the golden boy, the heir apparent. He was charming, handsome, and had a natural flair for both the military and politics. He even spent part of his youth in the imperial court, forming a close friendship with Britannicus, the son of Emperor Claudius. This was the fast track to power. Titus was learning the ropes, making connections, and building the persona of a future emperor. Domitian, meanwhile, had a very different kind of education. Don't mistake being left behind for being neglected. Domitian received a first-class education, typical for a boy of his standing. He was immersed in rhetoric, poetry, and law. Ancient sources, even those hostile to him later, admit he was highly intelligent and well. He developed a deep appreciation for arts and literature, something that would define his reign later on. He wasn't a bumbling fool in his brother's shadow. He was a sharp, cultured young man who simply lacked the opportunity to prove it. He was learning from books, while Titus was learning from battlefields. This period instilled in him a powerful, and perhaps dangerous, mix of qualities. On one hand, he was ambitious. He knew his family was destined for greatness, and he saw himself as an integral part of that destiny. On the other hand, a quiet resentment began to fester. Every triumph of Titus, every cheer for his brother, was a reminder of his own secondary status. Suetonius tells us he spent much of his youth in poverty and even disrepute, a claim that might be exaggerated but points to a feeling of being overlooked and under-resourced compared to the celebrated heir. The real turning point, the moment that solidified this dynamic, was the year of the 4 emperors in 69 AD. As Vespasian made his bid for the throne from the east, Titus was right there with him, his trusted second-in-command, a seasoned general. And where was Domitian? It was in Rome, essentially a political hostage under the crumbling regime of Emperor Domitian. He was not a commander. He was a symbol, a potential bargaining chip. While his father and brother were leading legions, Domitian was forced into hiding. He had to disguise himself, seeking refuge in the Temple of Isis, to escape Vitellius' forces who were hunting down Vespasian's family. He experienced the chaos and danger of civil war firsthand, but not as a soldier. He was a survivor, relying on his wits and the loyalty of others to stay alive. When Vespasian's forces finally took Rome, they found Domitian emerging from hiding. It was hailed as Caesar, a prince of the new dynasty. But the title must have felt hollow. He hadn't won it through heroic deeds like his brother. He had simply endured. In the immediate aftermath, Domitian had his first taste of power, but it was a clumsy and ill-fated affair. With Vespasian and Titus still in the east, Domitian was the family's senior representative in Rome. He was only 18, and his ambition, long suppressed, burst forth. He began issuing edicts and making appointments, reportedly taking on more authority than was given to him. He tried to seize a military command for a campaign in Gaul, an attempt to finally get the military glory that had always been denied to him. His father, Vespasian, gently but firmly reined him in. Letters from the new emperor reminded Domitian of his place. One can almost hear the weary sigh of a father telling his overeager son to calm down and wait his turn. When Vespasian and Titus finally returned to Rome in 70 AD, the message was clear. Titus, fresh from his victory in the Judean War and the destruction of Jerusalem, celebrated a magnificent triumph with his father. Domitian was given a minor role in the procession, riding a simple white horse. He was part of the celebration, but he wasn't the one being celebrated. Throughout Vespasian's 10-year reign, this pattern continued. Titus was groomed for power. He was made Praetorian prefect, shared consular powers, and was actively involved in every aspect of governance. He was the coroller, the partner. Domitian, by contrast, was showered with honors, and Title Z was named Caesar. Held multiple consulships, but these were largely ceremonial. He had the titles of power, but not the substance. He was kept on the sidelines, given no major military commands, and no significant provincial responsibilities. Vespasian wasn't being cruel. He was likely being practical. He had one proven, experienced heir in Titus. But for Domitian, this must have been agonizing. He spent his 20s in a state of gilded idleness. He dedicated himself to poetry and architectural projects, retreating from the political stage where he felt he had no real role to play. He was the spare, not the heir. This constant state of being overshadowed, did not diminish his ambition. It concentrated it. It turned his desire for recognition into a burning need to prove himself, to show everyone his father, his brother, and all of Rome that he was more than just the forgotten son. This period of his life is crucial to understanding the man he would become. The intelligence was there, the education was there, and the ambition was certainly there. But it was all filtered through a lens of resentment and the deep-seated insecurity of someone who felt perpetually sick. He learned that power wasn't freely given. It had to be taken. And he learned that the shadow of a beloved brother is a very cold place to grow up. The quiet, observant boy from Pomegranate Street was watching, learning, and waiting. His time would come, and when it did, he would be determined to cast a shadow of his own, one that would stretch across the entire Roman Empire. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into Domitian's early life. It's a fascinating story of family dynamics and ambition against the epic backdrop of Rome. If you enjoyed this, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter, where we'll see Domitian finally ascend to the throne and begin to enact his own powerful and controversial vision for the empire. See you next time. The year is 68 AD. The Roman Empire, a vast and seemingly unbreakable titan, is teetering on the brink of collapse. The final, decadent years of Nero's reign have poisoned the well of Roman stability. The emperor, once hailed as a golden boy, has become a tyrant, more interested in his artistic pretensions than the welfare of his people. His extravagance is legendary, his cruelty terrifying. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD left scars not just on the city's landscape, but on its soul. Nero, fiddling while Rome burned, became the symbol of a leadership completely detached from reality. Whispers of his blame for the fire, his persecution of Christians, and the forced suicides of his political rivals all simmered beneath the surface, a pressure cooker of resentment waiting to explode. And explode it did. The first domino to fall was in the provinces. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, could no longer stomach Nero's tyranny. He openly rebelled, calling Nero an incompetent actor and a disgrace to the Roman name. Vindex knew he couldn't stand alone, so he reached out to another powerful governor, Servius Sulpicius Galba in Hispania. Galba, a respected, elderly senator, was initially hesitant, but when he learned Nero had secretly ordered his own execution, his hand was forced. He declared himself not an emperor, but a legate of the Senate and the Roman people. The rebellion was on. Back in Rome, the news sent shockwaves through the city. Nero, ever the performer, at first dismissed it, but as more legions declared for Galba, panic set in. His own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers meant to protect him, were bribed to abandon their post. The Senate, smelling blood in the water, declared Nero a public enemy. Suddenly, the most powerful man in the world was a fugitive in his own city. Abandoned by everyone, he fled Rome and, with the help of a loyal freedman, took his own life, famously uttering, "What an artist dies in me." Nero's death didn't bring peace. It created a power vacuum. What followed was a year of absolute chaos, a bloody civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba marched on Rome and was declared emperor, but his reign was short. He was old, stern, and fiscally severe. He refused to pay the donatives promised to the Praetorian Guard who had put him in power. A fatal mistake. A charismatic and popular aristocrat named Otho, who had hoped to be Galba's heir, saw his chance. He conspired with the disgruntled Praetorians. In January of 69 AD, they dragged Galba from his litter in the Roman Forum and brutally murdered him. The first emperor of the year was dead after just 7 months. Otho was now emperor, but his claim was immediately challenged. The legions stationed along the Rhine frontier had their own candidate, their commander Aulus Spitelius. They proclaimed him emperor and began their march on Italy. The armies of Otho and Vitellius clashed at the First Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho's forces were defeated. Rather than drag the empire through a prolonged conflict, Otho chose to take his own life, hoping to restore peace. So fell the second emperor. Vitellius entered Rome not as a savior, but as a conqueror. His reign was marked by gluttony and excess, a crude parody of Nero's own decadence. He indulged in lavish banquets while the empire's treasury dwindled and his soldiers ran riot through the city. It quickly became clear that Vitellius was no more fit to rule than his predecessors. The Roman world was desperate for a true leader, someone who could bring order from the chaos, a man of substance and military prowess. And all eyes turned to the east. While Rome burned and emperors rose and fell, a seasoned and highly respected general was commanding Roman forces in Judea, putting down a major revolt. His name was Titus, Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasianus. He wasn't a blue-blooded aristocrat from an ancient family. He was a new man from a humble equestrian family. He was practical, experienced, and widely admired by his troops. He had served with distinction in Britain and Germany, and he commanded the loyalty of the powerful Eastern legions. The governor of Syria, Gaius Licinius, Mucianus, and the prefect of Egypt, Tiberius Julius Alexander, saw the opportunity. They controlled the vital grain supply to Rome. They urged Vespasian to make a bid for the throne. In July of 69 AD, the legions in Egypt, and then Judea and Syria, proclaimed Vespasian emperor. The tide had turned. While Vespasian secured the east and its critical resources, Mucianus led a part of the army towards Italy. The legions along the Danube, loyal to Vespasian, didn't wait. They marched on Italy themselves under the command of Antonius Primus. The forces of Vespasian and Vitellius met at the Second Battle of Bedtime. This time, the fighting was far more savage. It was a brutal, fratricidal conflict. Roman against Roman. Vespasian's Danubian legions were victorious. Vitellius's army was shattered. The path to Rome was open. As Vespasian's army approached the capital, Rome itself descended into a final, bloody spasm of violence. Vitellius, in a moment of panic, attempted to abdicate, but his own supporters forced him to stay. Fighting broke out on the streets of the city. In the chaos, the capital, the Sacred Heart of Rome, with the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, was set ablaze and destroyed. It was a profound sacrilege, a symbol of the depths to which Rome had sunk. Hiding within the city during this carnage was Vespasian's younger son, Domitian. Only 18 years old, he watched as history unfolded in fire and blood. He narrowly escaped capture and death by disguising himself and hiding. These terrifying events would leave an indelible mark on him, teaching him a brutal lesson about the fragility of power and the ruthlessness required to hold it. He witnessed firsthand the shifting loyalties, the raw violence, and the ultimate price of failure. Finally, Vespasian's troops stormed the city. They hunted down Vitellius, dragging him from his hiding place. He was tortured, killed, and his body thrown into the Tiber River. The fourth emperor of the year was dead. The Senate, with little choice, officially recognized Vespasian as emperor. The civil war was over. Out of the ashes of Nero's fall and the bloody year of the four emperors, a new dynasty was born. The Flavians. Vespasian, a pragmatic soldier, had seized power not through noble birth, but through military might and popular support. He was the man the empire needed, a stabilizer, a rebuild. He would restore the state's finances, begin the reconstruction of the city including the magnificent amphitheater we now know as the Colosseum, bring a much-needed sense of order and discipline. The era of Julio-Claudian drama was over. The era of Flavian pragmatism had begun. The turmoil had been horrific, but it had forged a new path for Rome, a path led by a family who understood, better than anyone, the true cost of power. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey back to one of Rome's most turbulent years. If you found this story as fascinating as we do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter in this incredible saga. We'll see you next time. Imagine being a prince, the son of an emperor, living in a palace surrounded by unimaginable luxury and power. Sounds like a dream, right? Well, for one young man it was more like a gilded cage. This is the story of Domitian, the forgotten son, a prince without power. Welcome back to our series on the Flavian dynasty. In our last episode, we saw Vespasian and his elder son, Titus, triumphantly return to Rome, celebrated as heroes who had saved the empire from chaos. But what about Vespasian's younger son, Domitian? While his father and brother were covered in glory, Domitian was left behind, a spectator to their success. During Vespasian's reign, Rome was buzzing with reconstruction and renewal. The Colosseum, that eternal symbol of Roman might, began its rise from the ashes of Nero's golden house. New temples were built, the treasury was refilled, and a sense of stability returned to the empire. Vespasian was a practical, no-nonsense emperor, and his son Titus was the beloved military hero, the heir apparent, and Domitian. He was given a handful of honorary titles: Caesar Princeps Juventutis, or Prince of Youth. But these were just empty words. They came with no real authority, no legions to command, no provinces to govern. He was a prince, in name only. Think about the frustration. While Titus was celebrated for his conquest of Jerusalem, Domitian was stuck in Rome, attending Senate meetings, where his opinion was politely ignored. He would watch as his father and brother made decisions that shaped the world, while he was relegated to ceremonial duties. He was the understudy who never got to go on stage. The ancient historian Tacitus tells us that during this time, Domitian feigned an interest in poetry and literature, not because he was a passionate artist, but as a way to mask his political ambitions and avoid his father's suspicion. He was playing a role, hiding his true desires behind a curtain of intellectual pursuits. This period of forced inactivity was not wasted. However, it became Domitian's training ground. He was a silent observer in the corridors of power. He watched the senators, noting who was loyal, who was ambitious, and who was deceitful. He learned how his father, a master politician, managed the complex web of Roman alliances, appeased the military, and kept the populace happy with bread and circuses. He studied the art of governance from the sidelines, absorbing every detail, every success, and every mistake. Every snub, every condescending glance from a senator who saw him as just the spare son, fueled a fire within him. He wasn't just frustrated. He was learning. He was forging a deep-seated resentment for the senatorial elite who looked down on him. A resentment that would have explosive consequences later on. There's a fascinating story from this time that reveals his character. The historian Suetonius tells us that Domitian would spend hours alone in his room, catching flies and stabbing them with a stylus. When someone once asked if anyone was with the emperor, a courtier famously replied, "Not even a fly." While this might sound like a bizarre and cruel hobby, it's a powerful metaphor for his state of mind. Trapped and powerless, he could only exercise absolute authority over the smallest, most insignificant creatures. It was a grim rehearsal for the absolute power he craved and believed was his destiny. He felt he was destined for greatness, just like his father and brother. He believed he had the same blood, the same abilities, but he was constantly denied the chance to prove it. This sense of destiny was a powerful motivator. He wasn't just jealous. He was convinced that he was meant to rule. He saw his father and brother as simply paving the way for his own inevitable reign. This period, which seemed like a quiet chapter in his life, was actually the most formative. It was the calm before the storm. The years of being sidelined, of being underestimated, were shaping him into the ruler he would become. Meticulous, suspicious, and absolutely determined to never be powerless again. The prince in the shadows was sharpening his claws, waiting for his moment in the sun. And when that moment came, Rome would discover that the forgotten son had a very long memory. What happens when a man who has been denied power his whole life suddenly gets all of it? That's the story we'll explore in our next chapter, as Domitian's wait finally comes to an end. Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the lives of the Roman emperors, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Friends, history buffs, welcome back. Today, we're diving into a pivotal, shadowy moment in Roman history. The sudden and mysterious death of the Emperor Titus. It's a story of power, suspicion, and a dynasty on the brink. Imagine Rome, in 81, the empire is basking in the glow of Emperor Titus. He's known as the delight of mankind. He'd handled the eruption of Vesuvius, a devastating fire in Rome, and a plague with compassion and efficiency. The people loved him. He was seen as the continuation of his father Vespasian. He's a steady hand, a golden age in the making. But this golden age was destined to be tragically short. In the late summer of 81 AD, after just 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days on the throne, Titus fell ill. He was traveling back to his family's ancestral villa in the Sabine Hills when he was struck by a severe fever. The accounts say he was in a litter, and as his condition worsened, he looked to the heavens and lamented that his life was being taken from him, undeservedly. He insisted he had only one major regret, one act he wished he could undo. To this day, historians debate what that single act could have been. Was it a military decision, a personal failing, or something to do with his brother, Domitian? This is where the story takes a dark and conspiratorial turn. With Titus on his deathbed, his younger brother Domitian was right there, and Domitian's actions were, let's say, highly suspicious. While Titus was still breathing, Still clinging to life, Domitian reportedly rushed back to Rome. He went straight to the Praetorian Guard barracks, the elite soldiers who were the emperor's personal bodyguards and the ultimate power brokers in the city. There, he had himself proclaimed the new emperor, even before his brother was officially declared dead. It was a bold, almost disrespectful move that showed an incredible hunger for power. The ancient sources, particularly writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, don't just stop at Domitian's hasty power grab. They whisper of something far more sinister. One of the most shocking theories is that Domitian actively hastened his brother's death. Suetonius presents a chilling account. As Titus's fever raged, Domitian allegedly ordered him to be plunged into a chest packed with snow. The idea was supposedly to treat the fever, but in his weakened state, the extreme cold would have been a lethal shock to his system. Was this a crude, misguided medical treatment, or was it a calculated act of murder, disguised as a desperate cure? Another version of the story suggests that Domitian had been plotting against Titus for some time. There were rumors that he had tried to bribe the army to rebel against Titus and had even considered poisoning him. Titus, ever the benevolent brother, reportedly forgave Domitian each time, pleading with him not to seize through crime what would eventually be his by-inheritance anyway. Titus believed in family, in their shared destiny. He might have seen Domitian's ambition as youthful impatience, not a murderous obsession. This, perhaps, was his fatal flaw, underestimating the depths of his brother's desire for the throne. So, on September 13th, 81 AD, Titus died. He was only 41 years old. The official cause was fever, likely malaria or another infectious disease common in the Roman countryside. But the whispers never went away. The Roman Senate, upon hearing of Titus's death, mourned him deeply. They immediately voted to deify him, officially making him a god, an honor reserved for the most beloved emperor. They praised his short reign and cursed his unfortunate fate. But while the Senate and the people mourned, Domitian was solidifying his power. The Praetorian Guard had already acclaimed him. He entered the Senate, not as a grieving brother, but as the new Augustus. He delivered a speech, accepted the titles and powers of the emperor, and just like that, the Flavian dynasty had its third and final ruler. The transition was seamless, almost too seamless. The speed with which Domitian took control, combined with his previous actions, forever cemented the suspicion that he had, at the very least, eagerly awaited his brother's death, and at worst, had engineered it. This event is crucial because it sets the stage for Domitian's entire 15-year reign. He came to power under a cloud of doubt. Unlike his father and brother, who had earned their authority through military victory and popular acclaim, Domitian's rule began with a question mark. Did this initial insecurity contribute to the paranoia and authoritarianism that would later define his time as emperor? Did he feel he constantly had to prove himself, to erase the stain of his brother's suspicious death? It's a fascinating psychological puzzle. The death of Titus marks the end of a brief, hopeful chapter and the beginning of a much more complex and turbulent one. It's a classic tale of two brothers, one beloved by all, the other consumed by ambition. Whether Domitian was a murderer or simply a ruthlessly opportunistic politician, the death of his brother was the key that unlocked the imperial palace for him. It was a turning point that would shape Roman history for the next decade and a half, leading to a reign marked by both administrative brilliance and terrifying tyranny. The shadow of Titus's final fevered hours would loom large over the empire for years to come. What do you think? Was Domitian a cold-blooded killer, or was he just in the right place at the right time? Let me know your theories in the comments below. It's one of history's most compelling cold cases. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Roman world. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please hit that like button. And do you want to forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss our next historical investigation? Until next time, stay curious. Scene opens on dramatic imagery of Rome, perhaps a bust of Domitian or coins with his likeness when Titus, the beloved emperor, drew his last breath in 81 AD. Rome held its own. Would the next emperor, his younger brother Domitian, live up to the Flavian family name? The people, the Senate, the army, they all watched, waiting. Domitian didn't make them wait long. He stepped out of his brother's shadow, not with a stumble, but with a stride of absolute authority. The time for mourning was over. The era of Domitian had begun. Unlike his father Vespasian or his brother Titus, who had earned their laurels on the battlefields of Judea, Domitian's path to power was paved with political maneuvering and administrative experience in Rome. He wasn't a soldier emperor in the traditional sense. He was a bureaucrat, a micromanager, and he saw Rome not as a prize to be won, but as a complex machine to be fine-tuned to perfection. His first actions as emperor weren't grand gestures of public celebration, but a series of cold, calculated decrees that sent a clear message. There was a new master in the palace, and he meant business. His first target, the very heart of the empire. Its finances. Vespasian had pulled Rome back from the brink of bankruptcy after the chaotic reign of Nero and the Year of the Four Emperors. Titus had continued this fiscal prudence, but Domitian saw waste and inefficiency everywhere. He began a sweeping reorganization of the treasury. Tax collectors, who had long enjoyed a reputation for corruption, suddenly found themselves under intense scrutiny. Domitian demanded absolute accountability. He personally reviewed financial records, rooting out embezzlement and punishing offenders with a severity that shocked the system. There would be no more skimming off the top. Every denarius owed to the state would be collected and accounted for. This wasn't about greed. For Domitian, it was about order. A strong empire, he believed, rested on a full treasury. Next, he turned his attention to the city of Rome itself. A great fire in 80 AD had ravaged parts of the capital, including the Capitoline Hill. While Titus had begun the rebuilding efforts, Domitian took them to a whole new level. He initiated a massive construction program, but with a distinct style. He restored the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus with lavish materials, including a gilded roof, but he also made sure his own name was prominently inscribed on it and other restored buildings. It was a statement. Asterisk. I am the restorer of Rome. He also completed the Colosseum, which his father had started, and built a new stadium, the future Piazza, Navona, and a concert hall. But these projects were managed with an iron fist. Costs were strictly controlled, and deadlines were non-negotiable. The city was being rebuilt, not just as a home for its people, but as a monument to its emperor's efficiency and power. But perhaps the most profound change was the cultural shift he enforced. Domitian was a staunch traditionalist, a moralist who was genuinely offended by what he saw as the declining morals of the Roman elite. One of his earliest and most shocking decrees was the revival of the Lex Continia, an old law against certain forms of sexual misconduct that had long fallen into disuse. He used it to prosecute and exile several senators and equestrians. The message was clear. The lax, decadent days were over. He also took his role as Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, with deadly seriousness. He famously enforced the ancient punishment for Vestal virgins who broke their vow of chastity being buried alive. When 2 Vestals were accused, he didn't hesitate. This act sent a terrifying chill through the Roman aristocracy. This wasn't just policy, it was a crusade for moral purity, with the emperor as its unyielding champion. This insistence on discipline extended to every corner of the administration. Provincial governors who had once ruled their territories like personal kingdoms were now subject to Domitian's constant oversight. He sent his own agents, the asterisk, frumentari, asterisk, originally grain supply officers, to act as a secret police, reporting directly to him. Corruption that was once tolerated was now ruthlessly punished. The result was, by many accounts, a period of remarkably good governance. The common people living far from Rome actually benefited from an emperor who ensured their governors were unexploiting them. But for the elite governors themselves, it felt like living in a gilded cage, always being watched by the Emperor's ensigns. The army, the foundation of any emperor's power, was not exempt. Domitian understood the importance of military loyalty. He was the first emperor since Augustus to spend a significant amount of time with the legions on the frontiers, not just for a single campaign, but for extended periods. He personally led campaigns in Germany against the Chatti tribe and later on the Danube frontier against the Dacians. He raised the soldiers' path of first increase, in a centuria move that secured their adoration. But with this generosity came an unbending demand for discipline. He drilled the troops relentlessly and held his generals to impossible standards. Success was expected. Failure was not an option. He cultivated an image of himself as a soldier emperor, even if his real talent lay in administration. The coins of his reign frequently depict him in military dress, a constant reminder to everyone that he was the supreme commander. In Thessalonica, the mood was turning from cautious optimism to quiet dread. Domitian treated the senators not as partners in governance, but as subordinates. He held the consulship 10 times during his reign, far more than his predecessors, symbolizing his dominance over the traditional republican magic. He would sit in the Senate, listening silently, his imposing figure and cold gaze making even the most powerful men in Rome nervous. He rarely asked for their opinion. He simply informed them of his decisions. He began to style himself Dominus et Deus, Master and God. While previous emperors had been deified after their death, Domitian demanded to be treated as a living deity. For the proud Roman aristocracy, this was an unbearable humiliation. They were no longer the advisors to the first citizen, the princeps. They were the subjects of a king, a master. So, in these first few years, the character of Domitian's reign was forged. It was a reign of efficiency, of order, of fiscal stability, and of military strength. The provinces were better run, the city was more magnificent, and the treasury was secure. From a purely administrative standpoint, Domitian was one of the most effective emperors Rome had seen, but this efficiency came at a terrible price. It was achieved through fear, control, and an absolute insistence on personal authority. The air in Rome grew thick with suspicion. His cold, demanding, and autocratic style created a foundation, not of loyalty, but of simmering resentment. The new emperor had taken command, and Rome was running better than ever. But beneath the surface of this well-oiled machine, the seeds of paranoia and tyranny were beginning to sprout, setting the stage for one of the most terrifying reigns in Roman history. Thank you so much for watching. If you're fascinated by the complex characters of the Roman Empire, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next chapter. Welcome back to our series on the Flavian Dynasty. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7, Strengthening Imperial Authority, and the man at the center of it all, Domitian. Imagine an emperor who looked at the sprawling, sometimes chaotic Roman Empire and thought, this needs to run like a well-oiled machine, like my legions on the march. That, in a nutshell, was Domitian's vision. He wasn't just another emperor. He was a micromanager, a reformer, and in the eyes of some, a tyrant. He inherited an empire stabilized by his father, Vespasian, and brother, Titus. But Domitian believed it needed more than just stability. It needed absolute, centralized control. So, how did he do it? He began by overhauling the very engine of the Roman state, its bureaucracy. Before Domitian, administrative roles were often filled by freedmen, former slaves who had gained their freedom and, through skill or favor, risen to positions of immense power. While many were competent, their loyalty was often to their former masters or to their own personal gain. Domitian saw this as a weakness. He wanted a professional civil service, one loyal not to an individual, but to the state, and by extension, to the emperor himself. He began systematically replacing these powerful freedmen with members of the equestrian order, the class of Roman knights. These were businessmen, landowners, and career military officers. They were educated, ambitious, and most importantly, they owed their advancement directly to the emperor. This created a new class of professional administrators who were accountable, efficient, and loyal. It was a brilliant move, shifting the bedrock of power away from personal networks and placing it firmly in the hands of the imperial office. The treasury, the provincial administration, the imperial correspondence, all of it was now managed by men whose careers depended entirely on the emperor's favor. But reforming the bureaucracy wasn't enough. Domitian had his sights set on another, much older institution: the Roman Senate. For centuries, the Senate had been the heart of Roman political life. Though its power had waned significantly since the days of the Republic, it still held immense prestige and symbolic authority. Senators were the traditional ruling class, the aristocrats who saw themselves as partners in governing the empire. Domitian saw them differently. He saw them as an obstacle. In his quest for absolute efficiency, he couldn't be bothered with the Senate's debates, its traditions, or its bruised ego. He wanted action, not deliberation. So, he began to sideline them. While his father Vespasian had worked to rebuild a cooperative relationship with the Senate, Domitian treated them with undisguised contempt. He rarely consulted them on important matters of state, preferring to make decisions with his private council of advisors, his Concilium Principis. This wasn't just a matter of ignoring them. Domitian took active steps to subordinate the Senate. He appointed himself censor for life, or censor, perpetuus asterisk. This was an unprecedented move. The censorship was a powerful traditional office that gave its holder the authority to review the role of the Senate, expelling members deemed unworthy and appointing new ones. By holding this power permanently, Domitian effectively became the gatekeeper of the Senate. He could pack it with his own supporters and remove anyone who dared to oppose him. The message was clear. Your place in the Senate is not a right, but a privilege granted by me, the Emperor. This fundamentally altered the relationship between the Emperor and the aristocracy. They were no longer partners. They were subjects. This tightening grip bred resentment and fear among the senators, sowing the seeds of the conspiracies and anathema that would later define his reign in the historical record. With the bureaucracy professionalized and the Senate neutralized, Domitian's final move was to centralize all executive power in his own hands. He styled himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This wasn't just a flight of fancy. It was a political statement. While previous emperors had been deified after their deaths, Domitian demanded divine honors while he was still alive. It was a declaration that his authority was not granted by the Senate or the people of Rome, but was divinely ordained. This was the ultimate expression of autocracy. All lines of authority now ran directly to him. Governors in the provinces reported to him. Generals on the frontier answered to him. Tax collectors across the empire worked for him. Rome was no longer a partnership between emperor and senate. It was an absolute monarchy in all but name. He micromanaged everything, from the price of grain in the capital to the construction of new roads in faraway Britain. This centralization had its benefits. Under Domitian, the empire's finances were stabilized. He was a scrupulous administrator who clamped down on corruption and ensured taxes were collected efficiently. The provinces, for the most part, were well governed, free from the extortion and mismanagement that had plagued them in the past. The military was disciplined and effective, with Domitian often taking personal command on the frontiers. He built extensively in Rome, restoring buildings damaged by fire and commissioning grand new structures like the massive palace on the Palatine Hill, a home fit for a god. In many ways, his vision of an empire run like a well-oiled army was realized. It was efficient, it was orderly, and it was strong. But this efficiency came at a terrible price. The air in Rome grew thick with suspicion. Informers, or delators, thrived, reporting any hint of dissent to the emperor. Treason trials became common, and many prominent senators and officials were executed or exiled, their property confiscated by the state. The atmosphere of fear was palpable. Philosophers were expelled from Rome, seen as purveyors of dangerous ideas about freedom and tyranny. Free speech was extinguished. To speak ill of the emperor was to risk death. Domitian's palace, designed to project power and majesty, became a golden cage, isolating him from his people and even his own court. While the common people may have appreciated the stability and the grand games he provided, the elite, the very people whose cooperation was needed to run the empire, lived in constant terror. They saw an emperor who demanded not just obedience, but adoration. An emperor who had dismantled the last vestiges of the old republican order and replaced it with an undisguised autocracy. This created a paradox. The more Domitian consolidated his power to make the empire secure, the more insecure his own position became. His quest for absolute control bred absolute hatred among the ruling class. In the end, Domitian's system, built on efficiency and fear, could not save him. The conspiracies he so feared eventually materialized, not from the Senate floor, but from within the walls of his own palace. The very people he had elevated, the members of his own household staff, grew tired of living under the shadow of his paranoia. In 96 AD, he was assassinated by a conspiracy that included court officials and, allegedly, even his own wife, Domitian. His death marked the end of the Flavian dynasty. The Senate, which he had so thoroughly humiliated, immediately rejoiced. They passed a asterisk, damnatio memoria asterisk, against him, ordering his name to be chiseled off all public inscriptions and his statues to be torn down. They sought to erase him from history, but can you truly erase a legacy like Domitian? The historians of the day, men like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, were from the senatorial class he had terrorized, and they painted a portrait of him as one of Rome's worst tyrants. Yet, the administrative and bureaucratic reforms he put in place were so effective that they were kept and even expanded. Upamba, Tesocolt, Cudemperas, who followed him, like Nerva and Trajan. They inherited the efficient state machine that Domitian had built, but they chose to run it with a lighter touch, restoring a cooperative relationship with the Senate. Domitian's reign serves as a powerful lesson in Roman history. It demonstrates the tension between efficiency and freedom, between order and liberty. He gave Rome an efficient, centralized government, a model for the future of the empire. But he did so by creating a climate of fear and repression that ultimately consumed him. He strengthened imperial authority to its absolute peak, but in doing so, proved that even a lord and god could not rule by fear alone. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive into the complex reign of Domitian. It's a fascinating story of power, control, and unintended consequences. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Below is Domitian, a necessary reformer or a paranoid tyrant? Let's discuss. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the Flavian dynasty. Today, we're diving into the complex legacy of its final emperor, Domitian. While his reign is often overshadowed by tales of tyranny and paranoia, there's another side to him that literally reshaped the skyline of ancient Rome. This is the story of Domitian, the building emperor. After the Great Fire of 80 AD, Rome was a city in desperate need of a facelift. Domitian didn't just rebuild. Reimagined, he launched one of the most ambitious and magnificent building programs the city had ever seen. His vision was to transform Rome into a capital worthy of its vast empire, a city of marble and gold that would awe both its citizens and its enemies. Let's start on the Palatine Hill, the traditional home of Rome's elite. Here, Domitian completed the project his father Vespasian had started. The Flavian Palace, or as it's more famously known, the Domus Flavia. This wasn't just a home, it was a statement. The palace was divided into a public wing for official business and a private residence, the Domus. Imagine walking through its grand halls. The public area, the Domus Flavia, featured a massive basilica for legal proceedings, an enormous dining hall called the Senatio, and a grand audience hall, Teola Regia, where the emperor would hold court. The sheer scale was designed to impress and intimidate, reinforcing the emperor's divine authority. The ceilings were gilded, the floors were paved with exotic-colored marble, and fountains cooled the courtyards. It was the heart of imperial power, a place where the grandeur of the empire was on full display. Adjacent to this was the Domus Augustana, the emperor's private quarters. But private for an emperor was a relative term. It was still a sprawling complex with courtyards, gardens, and fountains. One of its most famous features was the hippodrome, or stadium-like garden. This wasn't for public races, but a private, elongated garden for the emperor's leisure, perfect for a stroll or private reflection. It was here, in this magnificent yet isolated palace, that the two sides of Domitian-esque personality were most apparent. The lover of grandeur and the paranoid ruler. The palace was designed with high walls and few access points, a beautiful cage for an emperor who trusted no one. It's said that he had the walls of his porticos lined with highly polished fengid stone, a mirror-like material so he could see anyone sneaking up behind him. This palace was both a monument to his power and a fortress against his fears. But Domitian's ambition extended far beyond his own residence. He undertook a massive restoration of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which had been damaged by fire. He didn't just repair it, he lavished it with extravagance. The roof was covered with gilded bronze tiles, and the doors were plated with gold. It was said to have cost a fortune, but for Domitian, it was a necessary tribute to the king of the gods, and a symbol of Rome as eternal strength. He also constructed a new temple dedicated to Vespasian and Titus, his deified father and brother, further cementing his family's divine status and right to rule. It was a brilliant piece of political propaganda, written in stone and marble. Beyond temples, Domitian gave Rome new public venues for entertainment. Perhaps his most beloved contribution was the Stadium of Domitian, which you can still trace today in the shape of Rome's famous Piazza Navona. Unlike the Colosseum, which was for gladiatorial combat, this massive stadium was built for athletic contests in the Greek-style foot races, wrestling, and discus throwing. It could hold up to 30,000 spectators and brought a new kind of festival culture to the city. Right next to it, he built an Odeon, a smaller, roofed theater specifically for musical and poetry competitions. By introducing these Greek-style games, Oragon Capitolinus, Domitian was trying to cultivate a more refined, Hellenistic culture in Rome, setting himself up as a patron of the arts and athletics, not just a military commander. Domitian's building spree also included practical structures. He built new horia, or warehouses, to secure the city's grain supply, and repaired aqueducts to ensure a steady flow of fresh water. He understood that a magnificent city also needed to be a functional one. His projects provided work for thousands, stimulated the economy, and directly improved the lives of Roman citizens. He was a micromanager, personally overseeing many of these projects to ensure they met his exacting standards of quality and magnificence. Architects and engineers were pushed to their limits, resulting in some of the most impressive structures of the era. So, how do we reconcile this building emperor with the paranoid tyrant described by historians like Tacitus and Suetonius? Perhaps they are two sides of the same coin. Domitianus' immense building program was fueled by his desire for absolute power and a legacy that would last in eternity. He wanted to be remembered as a god on earth, and his buildings were the temples to his own glory. The grandeur of his architecture was a projection of his own ego, a way to physically dominate the city and its people. The more he feared plots against him, the more he may have sought to solidify his power in tangible, monumental ways. His Rome was a city of awe, but also a city under the watchful eye of an emperor who saw conspiracies around every marble corner. His buildings were monuments to his vision, but also to his insecurity. In the end, despite his assassination and the subsequent damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of his memory, where his name was chiseled off, inscriptions, his architectural legacy could not be erased. Piazza Navona still holds the shape of his stadium. The ruins of his palace still dominate the Palatine Hill. Domitian left an indelible mark on Rome, a physical testament to a reign that was as brilliant as it was brutal. His buildings outlasted his statues and his name, proving that sometimes stone speaks louder than words. Thank you so much for joining me on this architectural tour of Domitian's Rome. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the lives of the Roman Emperor. Today, we're tackling one of the most controversial figures to ever wear the purple. Domitian and his ambitious, some might say obsessive, quest to become Rome's moral reformer. So, grab your toga and let's get into it. Imagine Rome at the end of the 1st century. It's the beating heart of a colossal empire, a place of incredible wealth, power, and, let's be honest, legendary decadence. The traditional values that had supposedly made Rome great: piety, family, and discipline were, in the eyes of many conservatives, eroding faster than a sandcastle in the tide. Enter Domitian. He takes the throne and looks around at the city's elites, at the wild parties, the scandalous affairs, and the general laissez-faire attitude, and he decides no more. He saw a society teetering on the brink of moral collapse, and he believed, with every fiber of his being, that it was his divine duty to pull it back. So, how does an emperor become a moral crusader? Well, Domitian didn't just give a few stern speeches. He went all in. One of his first targets was the entertainment industry. Roman theater, especially mime and pantomime, was wildly popular, but it was also notoriously risky. Actors were often seen as being of low moral character, and their performances could be incredibly bawdy. Domitian saw this as a source of corruption, a public display of the very laxity he wanted to stamp out. So, he brought down the hammer. He banned actors from performing in public and even expelled them from Italy. This was a huge shock to the Roman public. It would be like a modern government suddenly banning all movies and television shows. It sent a clear message. The party was over, but he didn't stop with the actors. Domitian turned his attention to the very fabric of Roman society, starting with its most sacred institution, the Vestal Virgins. These were the priestesses of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and they took a 30-year vow of chastity. To break this vow was considered one of the gravest sins imaginable, a sacrilege that threatened the safety of Rome itself. The punishment was severe, being buried alive. Now, prosecutions for this were incredibly rare. It was a scandal that no one wanted to touch. But Domitian wasn't afraid. He launched a series of high-profile investigations into the Vestals. Several were accused, and in a terrifying display of his authority, the chief Vestal, Cornelia, was condemned and executed in the ancient, horrifying manner. This sent shockwaves through the Roman aristocracy. Domitian was showing that no one, not even the most sacred figures in the state religion, was above his moral scrutiny. He was making an example, demonstrating his absolute commitment to restoring what he saw as Rome's lost piety. From the sacred, he moved to the secular. Domitian dusted off ancient laws against adultery that had been gathering dust for decades. Under these laws, a father could kill his adulterous daughter and her lover on the spot. A husband could kill his wife as lover under certain circumstances and was required to divorce his unfaithful wife. These laws were rarely enforced by Domitian's predecessors, who perhaps understood the complexities of human relationships. But Domitian began actively prosecuting members of the senatorial class for their private affairs. Imagine living in a society where the emperor himself is taking a personal interest in your love life. It created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia among the elite. Who would be next? Whose private secrets would be dragged into the public square for the emperor's judgment? This leads us to the big question. Was Domitian a sincere reformer or a towering hypocrite? This is where the story gets really complicated. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus, who are no fans of Domitian, paint a picture of a man who didn't practice what he preached. They whisper of his own numerous affairs, most notoriously with his own niece, Julia Flavia. According to these sources, Domitian carried on a long-term relationship with Julia, even after she was married to someone else. They claim he forced her to have an abortion, which ultimately led to her death. If these stories are true, and we have to remember they were written by his enemies, then his moral crusade looks like the height of hypocrisy. How could a man who supposedly lived such a scandalous private life have the audacity to judge others so harshly? Many of his contemporaries certainly saw it that way. They viewed his moral campaign not as a genuine effort to improve Rome, but as a tool of political control. By enforcing these strict, old-fashioned laws, Domitian could intimidate, disgrace, and eliminate his political rivals. An accusation of adultery or impiety could ruin a senator's career or even end his life. It was a perfect way to keep the powerful and ambitious aristocracy in a constant state of fear, always looking over their shoulders. From this perspective, the moral reforms were just a smokescreen for good, old-fashioned tyranny. It was a way to consolidate his own absolute power under the guise of protecting Roman virtue. However, there's another way to look at it. Let's try to see the world from Domitian's perspective for a moment. He was an autocrat, yes, but he may have genuinely believed that a strong moral foundation was essential for a strong state. Perhaps he saw the corruption and laxity of the elite as a genuine threat to the stability of the empire. Maybe he believed that as emperor, as the pater, patriae, the father of the fatherland, It was his responsibility to act as the nation's conscience, even if his own personal life was less than perfect. It's possible he saw his own failings as separate from his public duty. He might have thought, I am the emperor. I stand apart. My role is to enforce the rules for the good of Rome, regardless of my own actions. This is a common mindset for authoritarians throughout history. The idea that the leader is exempt from the laws they impose on everyone else. Furthermore, Domitian's reforms weren't entirely without support. There was a significant portion of Roman society, particularly the more traditional and conservative elements, who likely applauded his efforts. They too were dismayed by what they saw as the moral decay of their time. They would have seen Domitian not as a tyrant, but as a strong leader, finally restoring order and discipline. For them, the crackdown on actors, the punishment of the Vestals, and the prosecution of adulterers were necessary steps to save Rome's soul. They might have seen the complaints from the aristocracy as the whining of a corrupt elite who were angry that their decadent lifestyle was finally being challenged. So, while the senators and historians grumbled, many ordinary Romans might have been nodding in approval. Ultimately, Domitian's moral crusade is a fascinating case study in power, perception, and hypocrisy. Was he a sincere, if flawed, reformer trying to save his society's virtue? Or was he a cynical tyrant using morality as a weapon to terrorize his opponents? The truth, as is so often the case with history, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. He was likely a bit of both, a man who genuinely believed in the traditional Roman virtues, but was also more than willing to use that belief as a tool to cement his own absolute authority. His reign forced Romans to confront uncomfortable questions about the role of the state in personal life, the nature of hypocrisy, and the true meaning of virtue. These actions, this constant pressure on the Roman elite, created a pressure cooker environment. The senators who felt their private lives and public dignities were under constant attack grew to resent and fear him more and more each day. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was personal. And this simmering hatred would eventually boil over, contributing directly to the conspiracies that would ultimately bring his reign and his life to a violent end. The moral reformer would be brought down by the very people he sought to reform. What do you think? Was Domitian a misunderstood visionary or a hypocritical despot? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the complexities of Roman history, please give this video a thumbs up. And do you want forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you do want miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Flavians. Today, we're diving into Chapter 10, Domitian's military campaigns and his quest for glory. Now, when you think of Roman emperors, you might picture titans like Julius Caesar or Trajan, men who lived and breathed the battlefield. Domitian, well, he was a different breed. He wasn't a natural-born soldier, and you wouldn't find him leading a cavalry charge from the front. But don't let that fool you. Domitian understood one crucial thing about being an emperor. Military victory was the ultimate currency of power and prestige in Rome. Without it, your reign was built on shaky ground. So, while he might not have been a warrior, he was determined to be a victorious emperor, and he looked north, to the vast, challenging frontiers of Germania and the Danube River, to make his mark. This wasn't just about grabbing land. It was about securing the empire, taming troublesome tribes, and, most importantly, building his own legend. He needed triumphs, parades through Rome, and coins minted with his conquering profile. The people demanded it, the Senate expected it, and the legions, the real backbone of the empire, needed a commander-in-chief they could respect, or at least fear. Domitian's first major military undertaking was against the Chatti, a powerful Germanic tribe causing trouble across the Rhine. Instead of delegating entirely, Domitian did something that surprised many. He went to the front himself in 83 AD. He may not have been swinging a sword, but his presence mattered. It showed the troops that their emperor was invested, that this campaign was a top priority. He was an organizer, a strategist from the command tent, ensuring the legions were well supplied and the objectives were clear. This wasn't a reckless gamble. It was a calculated move. Under the skilled command of his generals, the Roman legions pushed into chatty territory, not just fighting, but building. They established a network of forts, watchtowers, and roads. This system, known as the Limes Germanicus, wasn't just a defensive wall. It was a statement. It was Rome projecting its power, controlling the frontier, and slowly strangling the chatty's ability to raid. The campaign was a resounding success. Domitian returned to Rome and celebrated a magnificent triumph. He took the title Germanicus, meaning conqueror of the Germans, a title he proudly stamped on coins and inscriptions across the empire. To the average Roman citizen, the message was simple. Domitian is a victor. He is keeping you safe. He is expanding Rome's glory. Critics, especially those in the Senate who already disliked him, whispered that the victory was overblown, a manufactured triumph against a minor threat. But for the army and the public, it was real. Domitian had delivered. He understood the theater of power, and this was his grandest performance yet. But the northern frontiers were a restless beast. No sooner had things quieted down in Germania than a much greater threat erupted along the Danube. This river was the emperor's lifeline in the east of Europe, and across it lay the formidable kingdom of Dacia, ruled by the brilliant and charismatic king. Unlike the fractured Germanic tribes, Decebalus had united the Dacians into a powerful state. Innocenta and his forces swarmed across the Danube, defeated a Roman legion, and killed the governor of Mysia. This wasn't a mere raid. This was a full-blown crisis. Domitian couldn't ignore this. The loss of a legion and its eagle standard was a profound humiliation for Rome. Once again, he traveled to the front. He divided the province of Mysia into two, creating a more responsive military command structure, and poured resources into the region. His general, Cornelius Fuscus, launched a bold counter-invasion of Dacia in 86 AD. But Fuscus, perhaps overconfident, marched deep into enemy territory and was ambushed in the treacherous Carpathian Mountains. His army was annihilated, and Fucianus himself was killed. It was a catastrophe. Another legion lost, another eagle captured by Decebalus. The situation was dire. The Danube frontier was on the verge of collapse. For Domitian, this was the ultimate test. His prestige as Germanicus was now overshadowed by a disastrous defeat. Lesser emperors might have panicked or retreated. Domitian doubled down. He appointed a new, more cautious general, Titus Julianus, who learned from Fuscus's mistakes. In 88 AD, Julianus led a carefully planned campaign and won a major victory against the Dacians at Tapae. The path to the Dacian capital, Sarmizegetusa, was now open. It seemed like a total Roman victory was within grasp. But just as things were looking up, fate threw another curveball. A revolt broke out on the German frontier, led by the governor of Upper Germania, Lucius Antonius. This forced Domitian to halt the Dacian War and divert troops to deal with the rebellion. The Saturninus revolt was quickly crushed, but it spooked the brief moment of internal strife, combined with the ongoing pressure from other tribes like the Marcomanni and Quadi, who were now threatening the Danube, forced his hand. He couldn't afford a long, grinding war in Dacia, while other frontiers were unstable. So in 89 AD, he did something highly controversial. He made peace with Decebalus. This wasn't a conqueror's peace. Rome recognized Decebalus as king, returned some prisoners, and most shockingly agreed to pay him an annual subsidy and provide Roman engineers to help build his fortifications. To Domitian's enemies in the Senate, this was an outrage. Paying a barbarian king, it was seen as a sign of weakness, a shameful tribute. They accused Domitian of buying a peace he couldn't win on the battlefield. But from Domitian's perspective, it was a pragmatic choice. He stabilized a dangerous front, turned Decebalus from an active enemy into a client king at least in theory, and freed up legions to secure the rest of the Danube. He saw it as a strategic success, a necessary compromise to protect the wider empire. He still celebrated a triumph for the war, presenting it to the public as a victory. But the whispers in the halls of power never stopped. So, how should we view Domitian as a military leader? He wasn't a Trajan, but he wasn't a Caligula either. He was a micromanager, an administrator who understood logistics and strategy better than frontline combat. His generals, men like Agricola in Britain, Julianus in Dacia, and the future Emperor Trajan himself, who served under Domitian, were highly competent. They respected his authority and his meticulous planning, but they also feared his wrath. Domitian demanded success and loyalty, and he was ruthless with failure or perceived betrayal. This created an effective, if tense, command structure. The soldiers on the ground seemed to appreciate him. He raised their path of first emperor to do so in over a century, and he personally oversaw their welfare on campaign. For the legionaries, a commander who showed up and made sure they got paid was a good commander. In the end, Domitian's military legacy is complex. He secured and expanded the German frontier with the Limes. He faced a monumental crisis in Dacia, and through a mix of military action and controversial diplomacy, he stabilized the situation, setting the stage for Trajan's later, more famous conquest. He was no great warrior, but he was an active and engaged commander-in-chief, who maintained the discipline of the army and the security of the empiress borders during a turbulent period. He craved military glory, and while he achieved some, it was always tainted by the criticism of an elite class that despised him. His reign proves that in Rome, the perception of victory was often just as important as the victory itself. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter on Domitian's military campaigns. It's a fascinating look at a different style of imperial leadership. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next chapter. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through the annals of Roman history. Today, we delve into a fascinating and rather unsettling period, a time when the line between mortal ruler and divine being became dangerously blurred. We're talking about the reign of an emperor whose ambition wasn't just to rule the world, but to be worshipped as a god within it. Imagine living in Rome, the bustling heart of the most powerful empire on earth. You're used to seeing emperors depicted as heroes, as divinely favored, even deified after their death by a grateful senate. But what happens when a living, breathing emperor declares himself a god? Not in the future, but right now. This is the story of Domitian and his demand to be addressed by a title that sent shivers down the spine of the Roman elite. Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. This wasn't just a quirky nickname or an exaggeration of his power. It was a fundamental shift in the nature of Roman rule. The early emperors, like Augustus, were careful to maintain the illusion of the Republic. They called themselves princeps, or first citizen. It was a delicate dance, a way of holding absolute power while pretending to be just one among equals. They were the foremost man in the state, not its owner. Domitian, however, shattered this illusion. By demanding the title Lord and God, he was making a clear and unambiguous statement. I am not your first citizen. I am your master, and you are not my fellow citizens. You are my subjects. This wasn't an entirely new concept. The idea of the divine ruler was common in the eastern provinces. In places like Egypt, where pharaohs had been gods for millennia, even some of Domitian's predecessors, like Caligula, had flirted with the idea. But Caligula's attempts were often seen as a sign of madness, a temporary insanity. With Domitian, it was different. It was systematic. It was policy. He didn't just suggest it. Enforced Italiano. Letters and official documents had to begin with this formula. When you approached him, you weren't just greeting a head of state. You were performing an act of worship. So, why did he do it? Was it pure megalomania, or was there a political strategy behind this seemingly audacious move? To understand this, we need to look at Domitian's background. He was the younger son of the Emperor Vespasian and the brother of Titus. He spent much of his early life in the shadow of his father and brother, both celebrated military commanders. When he finally came to power, he lacked their military prestige. Perhaps, by elevating himself to divine status, he was trying to create a new, unchallengeable source of authority. If you are a god, your decisions aren't open to debate. Your authority isn't derived from the Senate or the army. It comes from the heavens itself. It was a way to cement his power and place himself beyond the reach of mortal politics. The reaction in Rome was, as you can imagine, mixed and complex. For many ordinary people across the empire, especially in the eastern provinces, Worshipping the emperor wasn't a huge leap. They were accustomed to divine kingship. For them, the emperor was a distant, immensely powerful figure who guaranteed peace and stability. Attributing divinity to him was a way of making sense of that immense power. But for the Roman aristocracy, the senators, and the educated elite, this was a profound offense. It flew in the face of centuries of Roman tradition, which valued republican virtues and looked with suspicion on anything that smacked of Eastern-style monarchy. For a senator, whose ancestors might have helped expel the kings from Rome centuries earlier, being forced to address another man as Lord and God was the ultimate humiliation. It wasn't just a matter of protocol, it was a surrender of their identity and their dignity. It created a vast, unbridgeable chasm between the emperor and his most powerful subjects. The relationship was no longer one of partnership, however unequal. It was one of master and slave, admiration, respect, and even a healthy fear of the emperor's power morphed into a deeper, more resentful kind of dread. Every interaction with Domitian became a test of loyalty, laden with the risk of giving offense to a self-proclaimed deity. This cult of personality manifested in tangible ways. Statues of Domitian, not just in bronze or marble but in gold and silver, proliferated throughout the empire. He built a lavish palace on the Palatine Hill, a residence so grand it was nicknamed Domus Flavia. It was designed not just as a home, but as a temple, a sacred space where the divine emperor would grant audiences. The architecture itself was meant to awe and intimidate, to reinforce the message that anyone entering was stepping into the presence of a superior being. Imagine the atmosphere in that court. Whispers would replace conversations. A glance from the emperor could seal your fate. The air would be thick with paranoia. The historian Suetonius tells us that Domitian would begin his official letters with the phrase, "Our Lord and our God commands." Double quotes, this wasn't just arrogance, it was a tool of terror. Disobeying an emperor was treason. But disobeying a god? That was sacrilege. This fusion of political and religious authority gave him an unprecedented level of control. It allowed him to justify his purges of the Senate and his confiscation of property. Any opposition could be framed not as political dissent, but as this self-deification had a profound impact on the relationship between the emperor and the people. The earlier model, the first citizen, allowed for a degree of connection, at least in theory. The emperor was still Roman, a man who could be seen at the games or in the forum. Domitian, by placing himself on a divine pedestal, created an unbreachable distance. He became an isolated figure, surrounded by sycophants and spies, increasingly detached from the reality of his subjects' lives. This isolation, fueled by his demand for worship, bred suspicion. He saw conspiracies everywhere, and his reign became notorious for treason trials and executions. The fear he inspired in others was a reflection of the fear he himself felt. Ultimately, this strategy of ruling by divine right proved to be his undoing. While it may have cowed his subjects for a time, it also bred deep-seated resentment. The very senators and court officials who were forced to call him Lord and God were the ones who conspired against him. In 96 AD, Domitian was assassinated in his own palace. The Senate, which had endured years of humiliation, reacted with glee. They immediately passed a damnatio memoria, a condemnation of his memory. His statues were torn down, his name was chiseled off inscriptions, and all official trace of his reign was erased. The god emperor was, in the end, just a man. The story of Domitian's cult of personality is a powerful lesson in the nature of power. It shows how the desire for absolute control can lead a ruler to discard tradition, alienate their allies, and ultimately sow the seeds of their own destruction. He turned admiration into fear, and fear into hatred. He sought to become a god, but in doing so, he sealed his fate as a man despised by the very people he sought to rule. It's a stark reminder that true authority is not simply demanded. It must be earned. And no matter how high a pedestal one builds for oneself, it can always be torn down. Thank you so much for joining me today for this deep dive into a dark but fascinating chapter of Roman history. What do you think? Was Domitian a misunderstood political strategist or a delusional tyrant? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more stories from the ancient world. We'll see you in the next one. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the Flavian Dynasty. Today, we are retackling one of the most explosive and defining aspects of Domitian's reign, his disastrous relationship with the Roman Senate. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, yet feeling like you're surrounded by enemies in your own government. That was Domitian's reality. This wasn't just a political disagreement. It was a deeply personal, paranoid, and ultimately bloody conflict that would seal his legacy. So, where did all this bad blood come from? Well, it started almost immediately. Unlike his father Vespasian and his brother Titus, who made efforts to court the Senate and respect its traditions, Domitian had a different approach. He saw himself as an absolute ruler, a dominus et deus, Lord and God as he liked to be called. He believed his authority came directly from the gods, not from the consent of a bunch of aristocrats in togas. He bypassed the Senate, made decisions unilaterally, and appointed his own men to key positions, often from the equestrian class, completely sidelining the senators who felt they were the rightful partners in governing the empire. This attitude, as you can imagine, did not go over well. The senators, who were the traditional Roman elite, saw Domitian as an arrogant tyrant, a man who trampled on centuries of Roman tradition. They felt disrespected, powerless, and deeply resentful. They would mutter in the corridors of the Curia, whisper in their private villas, and complain about this upstart emperor who didn't know his place. Domitian, in turn, sensed this contempt. He wasn't stupid. He knew they despised him, and this knowledge began to fester, turning his natural suspicion into full-blown paranoia. The situation escalated dramatically after the revolt of Lucius Antonius. In 89 AD, Saturnus was a governor in Germania, superior and a senator. He launched a rebellion, which was quickly crushed, but for Domitian, it was the ultimate betrayal. He saw it as proof that his darkest fears were real. The Senate was actively plotting against him. This event marked a turning point. The trust, already fragile, was completely shattered. Domitian's reign now entered a much darker phase, often referred to as a reign of terror. He began to rely heavily on a network of informers. These were individuals who would listen for any hint of dissent or criticism against the emperor and report it back for a reward. A careless joke at a dinner party, a complaint about taxes, a philosophical discussion about the virtues of the old republic, any of it could be twisted into a charge of treason. Life for the senatorial class became a minefield of anxiety. Who could you trust? Your friend, your brother, your own slave. The social fabric of the elite began to unravel under the weight of this suspicion. This led to a series of high-profile treason trials. Domitian used the Maestas laws, originally intended to protect the dignity of the Roman people, as a personal weapon. Senators were dragged before tribunals on flimsy evidence, accused of conspiracy, disrespect, or even practicing magic or philosophy, The trials were often a sham. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, and the punishments were severe. Exile, confiscation of property, or, all too often, death. One of the most famous purges was against a group known as the Stoic opposition. These were senators and philosophers who admired figures like Cato, the Younger, and Brutus, men who had stood up to tyrants in the past. To Domitian, their philosophical discussions were not abstract debates. They were coded attacks on his rule. He saw their admiration for Republican heroes as a direct threat, so he acted decisively. Philosophers were banished from Rome, and prominent senators associated with them, like Herennius Senecio and Junius Rus, were executed simply for writing biographies that praised men Domitian considered enemies of the state. This constant threat had a chilling effect. The Senate, once a proud and deliberative body, was reduced to a rubber stamp for the emperor's will. Senators lived in fear, their primary goal shifting from governing the empire to simply surviving Domitian's. Next mood swing. They would shower him with public honors and titles, hoping to appease him, while privately their hatred grew more intense. Domitian, for his part, became more and more isolated. He retreated into his magnificent palace on the Palatine Hill, a fortress of marble and paranoia. He trusted almost no one. He would reportedly line the walls of his porticos with highly polished stone so he could see the reflection of anyone approaching from behind. This isolation only fed his fears. He saw plots everywhere. He executed members of his own family, including his cousin Flavius Clemens, on dubious charges. The man who called himself a god was living in a hell of his own making, terrified of the very people he ruled. He had all the power in the world, yet he was a prisoner of his own fear. This toxic relationship between emperor and senate is crucial to understanding Domitian's end. While the senate was too cowed to launch another open rebellion, the atmosphere of terror Domitian created had seeped into the very heart of his imperial household. The people closest to him, his own staff, court officials, even allegedly his wife Domitia Longina, began to fear that they would be next on his list. They saw that no one was safe, and it was this fear, born from his war against the Senate, that would ultimately lead them to conspire against him. They decided it was better to strike first than to wait to be struck down. In the end, Domitian's distrust of the Senate became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating them as enemies, he made them enemies. By purging supposed conspirators, he inspired a real conspiracy. His reign serves as a powerful lesson in leadership. Ruling through fear might bring obedience, but it never brings loyalty. It breeds resentment that festers in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And for Domitian, that moment came in September of 96 AD, when he was assassinated in his own palace. Not by a senatorial army, but by the very people he had surrounded himself with. Thanks so much for watching. This tragic dynamic really defined the latter half of Domitian's rule. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe for more, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll cover the assassination of Domitian and the aftermath. See you then. Hello and welcome back to our deep dive into the lives of the Roman Emperor. Today, we enter one of the darkest chapters in our series, the Reign of Terror under Domitian. This is the story of how an emperor, once hailed for his efficiency and administrative skill, spiraled into a vortex of suspicion and cruelty. This is Chapter 13, The Shadow of Paranoia. Imagine the grand halls of the Palatine Hill, once bustling with the business of a thriving empire, now hushed and filled with whispers. This was Domitian's Rome in his later years. The air itself seemed thick with suspicion. Every corner held a potential spy. Every friendly face could mask a dagger. Domitian's world had shrunk, contracting from a vast empire to the claustrophobic confines of his own fear. What triggered this dramatic change? To understand Domitian's paranoia, we must first look at the very real threats he faced. The Roman elite, the senators and aristocrats, had never truly embraced him. They saw him as an autocrat, a man who bypassed their ancient authority and concentrated all power in his own hands. His insistence on being addressed as Dominus et Deus Master and God was not just an act of ego. It was a direct challenge to the senatorial class, who viewed such titles as an affront to Roman tradition. Early in his reign, there were plots, both real and imagined. The rebellion of Lucius Antonius Saturninus, the governor of Germania Superior, in 89 AD, was a critical turning point. Although the revolt was swiftly crushed, it shattered Domitian's sense of security. It proved that even his highest-ranking officials, men he had appointed and trusted, could turn against him. The betrayal struck him deeply, planting a seed of mistrust that would soon grow into a monstrous, suffocating vine. From that moment on, Domitian saw conspiracies everywhere. He began to rely heavily on a network of informants known as Asterisk, Delator's Asterisk. These were professional accusers who, for a share of the condemned person's property, would bring charges of treason, asterisk, against wealthy citizens. It was a perfect system for a paranoid ruler. It required no real evidence, only insinuation and accusation. A misinterpreted joke, a forgotten birthday wish for the emperor, or simply owning too much land could be twisted into an act of treason. The Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, was paralyzed with fear. Senators would arrive for their meetings not knowing if they would return home. Pliny the Younger, a contemporary source, wrote of the silent and sorrowful atmosphere in the Senate House. Men who had once debated the fate of nations now sat in grim silence, their faces pale, avoiding eye contact lest a stray glance be misinterpreted as a sign of conspiracy. Domitian's paranoia wasn't just political. It became deeply personal and manifested in bizarre ways. The historian Suetonius tells us that Domitian had the walls of the porticos, where he walked lined with highly polished fengit stone. This wasn't for decoration. These stones acted like mirrors, allowing him to see what was happening behind him at all times. He lived in a state of constant vigilance, unable to turn his back on anyone. He was a prisoner in his own palace, haunted by the specter of an assassin's blade. Executions became commonplace. Prominent senators, respected military commanders, and even members of his own family fell victim to his suspicions. The philosopher Epictetus was banished from Rome, along with all other philosophers, because Domitian feared their teachings might inspire dissent. He purged his court of anyone he deemed a threat, replacing seasoned administrators with sycophants who would tell him only what he wanted to hear. This, of course, only isolated him further, feeding his paranoia in a vicious cycle. He trusted no one, so he surrounded himself with the untrustworthy, which in turn justified his initial lack of trust. The cruelty was not always swift. Domitian seemed to take a sadistic pleasure in the psychological torment of his victims. Cassius Dio recounts a chilling story of a dinner party Domitian hosted for a group of prominent senators and equestrians. When they arrived, they were led into a room draped entirely in black. The couches, the walls, the ceiling, all black. Each guest found their place set with a tombstone-like slab bearing their own name. Silent, bare-chested boys, painted black to resemble spirits of the underworld, performed a macabre dance before serving a feast fit for a funeral. The guests sat in terror, expecting to be executed at any moment. At the end of the night, Domitian dismissed them, sending them home in a state of shock. It was a terrifying display of power, a message that he held their lives in his hands and could snuff them out whenever he pleased. This climate of fear had a corrosive effect on Roman society. People stopped speaking freely. They became suspicious of their neighbors, their friends, even their own families. The social fabric of the city began to unravel under the strain of the emperor's paranoia. The once vibrant public life of Rome was replaced by a culture of fear and silence. Domitian was no longer just the emperor. He was the eye of a storm of terror that had engulfed the capital. Yet, it's important to remember the paradox of Domitian. While his paranoia consumed the elite in Rome, his administration of the provinces remained largely efficient. He kept a tight rein on his governors, ensuring they did not exploit the provincials. He maintained a strong and disciplined army, securing the empire's borders. The common people, for the most part, were unaffected by the terror that gripped the upper classes. Their lives continued, and the empire, as a whole, remained stable and prosperous. This duality makes Domitian a complex and fascinating figure. Was he a monster from the beginning? His true nature only revealed over time. Or was he a capable ruler driven to tyranny by legitimate threats and a fragile psyche? The truth, as is often the case in history, probably lies somewhere in between. His reign serves as a powerful cautionary tale about the corrupting nature of absolute power and the destructive force of fear. When a leader becomes more afraid of his own people than of his enemies, the path to tyranny is all but certain. Domitian's shadow of paranoia grew longer and darker with each passing year. But shadows cannot exist without light, and as his tyranny intensified, so too did the resolve of those who sought to end it. His reign of terror was spiraling toward a violent and inevitable conclusion. A final conspiracy was taking shape, not in the Senate House or on a distant frontier, but within the very walls of his own palace, among the few people he thought he could still trust. Join us next time as we witness the dramatic and bloody end of Domitian's reign and the Flavian dynasty. The emperor who lived in constant fear of assassination would finally meet his fate, and the empire would be plunged into uncertainty once more. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this chapter of Roman history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the ancient world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll see you then. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through Roman history. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and paradoxical era, the reign of Domitian, a time often called the Domitianic peace. Now, when you hear the word peace, you probably think of harmony and tranquility, but in Rome, things were never quite that simple. So, grab your virtual toga, and let's explore this age of contradiction. Domitian, the last of the Flavian emperors, is one of history's most debated figures. Ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius paint a picture of a paranoid, autocratic ruler, a man whose reign was marked by fear, suspicion, and a ruthless suppression of the senatorial class. They tell stories of show trials, summary executions, and an atmosphere where even the slightest whisper of dissent could lead to a death sentence. The heart of the empire, the city of Rome itself, seemed to be gripped by a quiet terror, especially for those in the upper echelons of society. You might imagine a city holding its breath, where senators looked over their shoulders, and poets censored their own verses for fear of offending the powerful emperor. But here's the twist, and it's a big one. If you were an ordinary person living in the vast Roman Empire during this same period, a merchant in Gaul, a farmer in Egypt, or a craftsman in Espagne, your experience might have been completely different. Ironically, while the elite in Rome trembled, the empire as a whole experienced a remarkable period of internal peace and stability. This is the great paradox of the Domitianic peace. So, how did this happen? How could a reign defined by fear at its center also be an era of widespread prosperity? Well, Domitian, for all his alleged cruelty towards the Senate, was an incredibly competent and meticulous administrator. He was a micromanager in the best sense of the word, at least when it came to running the empire. He demanded honesty and efficiency from his provincial governors, punishing corruption with a severity that was previously unheard of. This meant that for the average provincial, the days of being exploited by greedy self-serving governors were largely over. Taxes were collected fairly, justice was administered more impartially, and local administration ran like a well-oiled machine. This stability had a ripple effect across the entire economy. With corrupt officials kept in check, trade flourished. The famous Roman roads, the arteries of the empire, were safer than ever. A merchant could transport his goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other with a newfound sense of security. Piracy was suppressed on the seas, and banditry was clamped down on the land. This safety and predictability allowed commerce to thrive. The imperial treasury, which had been in a precarious state before, became full to bursting, not through excessive taxation on the masses, but through efficient collection and the elimination of graft. Domitian also invested heavily in public works, not just in Rome, but across the province. He repaired roads, built aqueducts, and fortified frontiers. These projects not only improved the quality of life for millions, but also provided employment and stimulated local economies. He was particularly focused on strengthening the empire's borders. While he wasn't a great expansionist like Trajan, he was a master of defense. He solidified the frontiers along the Rhine and Danube rivers, establishing a system of forts and watchtowers that would protect the empire for generations to come. This military focus ensured that the Pax Romana, the Roma, was not just an internal concept, but was actively defended from external threats. Furthermore, Domitian was a staunch traditionalist when it came to Roman culture and morals. He saw himself as a guardian of Roman values. He passed laws against what he saw as moral decay and spent lavishly on restoring temples and reviving ancient religious ceremonies. While his methods could be harsh, for example, his strict punishment for Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity's goal was to reinforce the cultural and religious fabric that he believed held the empire together. For many Romans, this emphasis on tradition and order was comforting. So, we are left with two very different pictures of the same man and the same era. Was Domitian a bloodthirsty tyrant who ruled through fear? For the Roman aristocracy, the answer was a resounding yes. Their accounts, which form the bulk of our surviving historical record, have forever stained his reputation. But was he also a diligent and effective ruler who brought peace, security, and prosperity to the vast majority of the empire's population? The evidence suggests that for millions of ordinary people, life under Domitian was good, perhaps better and more stable than it had been in living memory. This is what makes history so captivating. It's rarely black and white. The Domitianic piece is a perfect example of this complexity. It was an age of fear in the palace, but an age of function on the farm. A time of tension in the Senate, but a time of trade on the seas. It teaches us that a leader's legacy can be viewed through multiple lenses, and that the experience of a few powerful people in the capital city may not reflect the reality for the silent majority across a sprawling empire. The story of Domitian is a powerful reminder that peace can sometimes wear a fearsome mask, and stability can be forged in the fires of an iron will. What do you think? Was Domitian a misunderstood genius of administration, or a paranoid despot whose competence can't excuse his cruelty? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading your perspectives on these complex historical figures. Thank you so much for joining me today on this exploration of the Domitianic piece. If you enjoyed this journey into the paradoxes of the past, please give this video a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter in Roman history. Until next time, stay curious. Welcome back to our series on the Flavian Dynasty. Today, we're re-diving into a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of Domitian's reign: the world of arts and culture. When we think of Domitian, we often picture a stern, autocratic ruler. And while that's part of the story, it's not the whole picture. So, what was it really like to be an artist, a writer, or an architect under his watch? Let's find out. To understand the art of this era, you first have to understand the man in charge. Domitian was a complex figure. He saw himself as a grand restorer of Roman tradition and morals, a new Augustus. This ambition heavily influenced the cultural landscape. He wanted a Rome that was magnificent, orderly, and reflected his own glory. This created a very specific climate for creatives, one of immense opportunity, but also of significant risk. Let's start with literature. If you were a writer in Domitian's Rome, you walked a tightrope. On one hand, there was imperial patronage. Domitian himself was well educated and even wrote poetry in his youth. He established the Capitoline Games, which included artistic and literary competitions, offering poets and orators a massive stage. Winning here could make your career, but on the other hand, there was the ever-present threat of his displeasure. Domitian was notoriously sensitive to criticism. Anything that could be interpreted as a slight against him or his authority could lead to exile or worse. The historian Tacitus, who lived through this period, later wrote about a reign of silence, where free expression was stifled. Philosophers were expelled from Rome. Writers who praised figures seen as opponents to the emperor were punished severely. The result, a lot of self-censorship. Poets like Martial and Statius, two of the most famous voices of the era, are perfect examples. Their work is brilliant, technically superb, but it's also filled with flattering praise for the emperor. They celebrate his building projects, his military victories, his divine wisdom. Was this genuine admiration, or was it a survival strategy? It was likely a bit of both. They needed the emperor's favor to thrive, so they gave him what he wanted to hear. But this doesn't mean their work lacks value. Far from it. If you read between the lines, you can still find incredible artistry. Statius's epic poem, the Thebaid, is a masterpiece of mythological storytelling. Martial's epigrams give us these incredible, witty, and often scandalous snapshots of daily life in Rome. They might have had to flatter the man at the top, but their creativity still shines through, offering us a vivid, if carefully curated, glimpse into their world. They mastered the art of saying what was safe to say, while still producing works of lasting genius. Now, let's turn to architecture. This is where Domitian's legacy is arguably most visible and impressive. After the Great Fire of 80 AD, Rome needed to be rebuilt, and Domitian seized the opportunity with both hands. He embarked on one of the most ambitious building programs the city had ever seen, rivaling even that of Augustus. His masterpiece was the magnificent palace on the Palatine Hill, later known as the Flavian Palace or the Domus Augustana. This wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Designed by the master architect Riberius, it was a sprawling complex of public halls, private quarters, gardens, and fountains. It was designed to awe and intimidate. Imagine being an ambassador walking through the massive public audience hall, Tia la Regia, with its soaring ceilings and marble-clad walls, on your way to meet the emperor. The architecture itself was a tool of power, but Domitian didn't just build for himself. He also built for the people of Rome. He completed the Colosseum, adding the final top tier and the underground chambers, the Hypogeum, where gladiators and animals were kept. He built the Stadium of Domitian, a massive arena for athletic contests, the shape of which you can still see today in Rome's famous Piazza Navona. He also built a concert hall, the Odeon, and numerous temples, arches, and forums. He was transforming the very face of the capital, leaving his mark everywhere. What's interesting about Domitian's architectural style is its blend of innovation and tradition. His buildings were grand and used cutting-edge Roman engineering concrete, arches, domes, but they were often decorated with classical Greek motifs. This was all part of his brand. He was a modern, powerful ruler, but one who was also restoring the hallowed traditions of the past. His buildings were a physical manifestation of his ideology. Sculpture and the visual arts also flourished, though again, often in service of the imperial message. Portraits of Domitian show a fascinating evolution. Early on, he's depicted in a more realistic, veristic style, like his father but as his reign progressed, his portraits became more idealized, more heroic, even godlike. He was often shown with the attributes of Jupiter or Minerva, reinforcing his divine authority. But it wasn't all just propaganda. The level of craftsmanship during this period was exceptionally high. The reliefs on the Arch of Titus, which was completed by Domitian to honor his brother's victory in Jerusalem, are a prime example. They're incredibly dynamic and illusionistic, creating a sense of depth and movement that was revolutionary for its time. Art wasn't just stagnant. It was evolving, pushing boundaries, even within the tight constraints of imperial patronage. So, what is the ultimate legacy of arts and culture under Domitian? It's complex. On one hand, his reign was a period of fear and censorship for writers, forcing many into silence or flattery. Tacitus and Pliny the Younger would later frame their own literary careers as a recovery from this oppressive atmosphere. But on the other hand, it was a golden age for architecture and the visual arts. The sheer scale and quality of what was built is undeniable. Domitian's project shaped the city of Rome for centuries to come, and the artistic innovations of his era had a lasting impact. He was a patron and a censor, a builder and a tyrant. The culture of his time reflects this duality. It's a world of dazzling surfaces with carefully hidden depths, of public spectacle and private anxieties. It reminds us that, even in the most restrictive of times, human creativity finds a way to flourish, adapting, surviving, and leaving behind a legacy that is as complicated and fascinating as the man who oversaw it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Domitian's Rome. It's a period that deserves more attention than it often gets. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more journeys into history. Let me know in the comments what you think was Domitian, a cultural patron or a tyrant. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time. Welcome back to our series on the Flavian Dynasty. Today, we delve into chapter 16. The downfall begins. The year is 96 AD, and the once unshakable power of Emperor Domitian is starting to crack. The air in Rome is thick with tension, a silent storm brewing behind the marble facades of the Senate and the gilded walls of the Palatine Hill. For years, Domitian had ruled with an iron fist. His network of informants, the dreaded delatories, had silenced most opposition. Senators who dared to whisper dissent found their careers, and often their lives, cut short. But absolute power, as history teaches us, has a way of corrupting absolutely, and it also breeds a powerful and dangerous enemy, fear. And fear, when it reaches a tipping point, can turn into desperate courage. The conspiracies were no longer just hushed rumors in dark corners. They were becoming organized plots. Influential senators, men who had smiled and bowed to Domitian in public, began to meet in secret. They were tired of the purges, the constant threat of execution, and the emperor's growing paranoia, which he projected onto everyone around him. They saw an emperor who was increasingly isolated, trusting no one, and ruling not through respect, but through terror. This was not the Rome they believed in. The risk of inaction, they concluded, was now greater than the risk of action. These senators weren't fools. They knew Domitian's intelligence network was vast. Any plot would have to be meticulously planned, its participants bound by unbreakable trust. They began to subtly sound each other out, using coded language and trusted intermediaries. A knowing glance in the forum, a carefully chosen word during a private dinner, these were the seeds of rebellion being sown. The goal was simple and brutal: the removal of the Emperor, by any means necessary. Domitian, for his part, was no stranger to conspiracy. He had survived them before, but this time felt different. The silence from the Senate was deeper, more unnerving. The usual flatterers seemed hesitant, their praise laced with an undercurrent of anxiety. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. His paranoia, once a tool of control, was now consuming him. He started lining the walls of the porticos, where he walked with highly polished Cappadocian stone, so he could see reflections of anyone approaching from behind. Every shadow held a potential assassin. Every new face was a threat. He doubled his Praetorian guard, but could he even trust them? A soldier's loyalty could be bought. They lashed out, ordering new arrests and executions based on the flimsiest of suspicions. But each execution only created more enemies, more grieving families, and more senators convinced that they would be next. His attempts to secure his power were, ironically, accelerating his downfall. He was a man trapped in a fortress of his own making, and he was beginning to realize the walls were closing in. The most terrifying development for Domitian, however, was not happening in the Senate, but within his own home. The whispers of assassination had breached the imperial palace. The very people who served him his meals, who managed his household, who lived under his roof, were beginning to turn against him. This was the ultimate betrayal. These were people who saw him not just as an emperor, but as a man, a deeply flawed, cruel, and volatile man. Among the conspirators were men like Parthenius, his most trusted chamberlain, and Shafin, a steward of his own niece, Flavia Domitija. These were individuals with unparalleled access to the emperor, who knew his routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. Why did they turn? For some, it was personal. Domitian had executed their friends or patrons. For others, it was self-preservation. They saw the emperor's escalating paranoia and knew that one day his suspicion would inevitably fall on them. Imagine the atmosphere inside the palace. Every polite greeting, every bow was a lie. The servants moved through the halls with secrets in their eyes. The Empress, Domitia Longina, was also implicated. Her relationship with Domitian was fraught with tension and fear. Whether through active participation or by turning a blind eye, her loyalty was wavering. The conspiracy was no longer an external threat. It was a cancer growing within the heart of the imperial household. Domitian, obsessed with omens and astrology, had been warned that this period was dangerous for him. He consulted his seers, who gave him cryptic predictions that only fueled his anxiety. He felt like a hunted animal. The weight of the empire, which he had once carried with such arrogance, was now crushing him. He saw betrayal in the eyes of his wife, his servants, his most trusted officials. The plot was solidifying. The key players were in place, inside and outside the palace. They weren't just planning to remove a tyrant. They were planning the future of Rome. They had already selected his successor, a quiet, elderly, and respected senator named Nerva. This wasn't just about murder. It was about a controlled transition of power to prevent the chaos of a civil war like the one that had brought Domitian, his own father, to power. As the final days of Domitius' reign ticked down, the emperor was a man cornered. He had alienated the Senate, terrified his own staff, and lost the trust of those closest to him. The instruments of terror he had used to maintain his rule had now been turned against him. The stage was set for the final, bloody act of his life. The whispers had become a plan. The plan was about to become action, and that's where we'll leave it for today. The downfall of Domitian was not just the end of a single emperor, but the end of a dynasty and the dawn of a new era for Rome. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into Roman history. If you found this chapter as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion in our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. September 18th, 96 AD. The air in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill hung thick and heavy, not with the usual Roman heat, but with a palpable sense of dread. Emperor Domitian, A ruler whose name was synonymous with fear and absolute control was about to face the one thing no emperor could command: his own fate. For weeks, his paranoia had been spiraling. He had the walls of his porticos lined with polished moonstone, so he could see the reflection of anyone approaching from behind. Astrologers had warned him of this very day, pinpointing the 5th hour as the moment of his demise. He was so terrified that even a small pimple on his forehead, which he'd dismissed as a harmless sign of a long life, now seemed like a morbid omen. As the day dawned, Domitian was a bundle of nerves. He'd had a nightmare the night before, a vision of the goddess Minerva, his personal protector, abandoning her shrine, her weapons broken. This, to him, was the ultimate betrayal. He consulted another astrologer, who confirmed the grim prophecy. In a fit of rage and terror, Domitian had the man executed, but killing the messenger couldn't kill the message. He anxiously asked his servants what time it was. They, being part of a growing conspiracy against him, deliberately lied, telling him it was already the 6th hour. Relief washed over Domitian. The prophesied hour of danger had passed. Believing himself safe, he decided to proceed with his daily routine: a bath, followed by a light lunch. But the conspiracy was already in motion, a web of betrayal woven by the very people he trusted most. The primary conspirators were his own chamberlain, Parthenius, and Stephanus, a steward of his niece, Domitian. Stephanus, a man described as physically powerful, had been nursing a grudge. To gain access to the emperor, he feigned an injury, wearing his arm in a woolen bandage for days, claiming it was a terrible wound. But hidden within that bandage was not a wound, but a dagger. As Domitia, relaxed and off guard, was preparing for his bath, Stephanus approached him under the pretense of revealing a conspiracy. He handed the emperor a document, a list of supposed traitors. While Domitian was engrossed in reading the names, his focus entirely on the paper, Stephanus made his move. He drew the hidden dagger and lunged, stabbing the emperor in the groin. Domitian, though wounded and stunned, was a strong man. He didn't fall. He fought back with a fury born of desperation. He cried out for his loyal servant, a young boy who always kept a dagger under his pillow, to bring him a weapon. But the boy found only the hilt. The blade had already been removed by the conspirators. The emperor's personal guards, stationed right outside his chambers, heard the commotion, the shouts, the sounds of a life-or-death struggle. But they did not intervene. They were either part of the plot or too terrified of Parthenius to act. Their silence was as deadly as any blade. Domitian, unarmed and bleeding, grappled with Stephanus. He clawed at the assassin's eyes, trying to blind him, to fight him off with sheer brute force. But then, the other conspirators rushed in. Parthenius, a centurion named Maximus, a freedman of Parthenius named Sata, and even one of the imperial gladiators joined the fray. They fell upon the wounded emperor like a pack of wolves. It was no longer an assassination. It was a butchery. They stabbed him again and again, 7 more times. A brutal and bloody end in the privacy of his own bedroom. The man who had demanded to be called Lord and God, who had executed senators on a whim and held Rome in a grip of iron, died on the floor, bleeding out from 8 separate wounds. His body was left there for a time, a shocking testament to the swift and brutal nature of Roman power shifts. His end was as unceremonious as his rule had been tyrannical. His old nurse, a woman named Phyllis, was the only one who showed him any final kindness. She secretly had his body carried out on a common bier, cremated it in her own garden, and quietly mingled his ashes with those of his niece, Julia, whom he had loved. The Senate, which had lived in terror of Domitian, erupted in celebration upon hearing the news. They ordered his statues to be torn down, his name to be erased from all public inscriptions, a process known as damnatio memoriae. They wanted to wipe his very existence from the annals of history. But history has a long memory. The assassination of Domitian marked the end of the Flavian dynasty and paved the way for the era of the 5 good emperors, beginning with the elderly senator Nerva, who was proclaimed emperor on the very same day. It was a violent, bloody transition that underscored a timeless truth. Even the most powerful rulers are vulnerable, and often the greatest threat comes not from a foreign army, but from the whispered plots in the corridors of their own homes. The calm of that September morning was shattered by a betrayal that changed the course of the Roman Empire forever. Thank you for joining me on this journey back to ancient Rome. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. Your support means the world. See you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the annals of Roman history. Today, we're tackling a fascinating and brutal concept. Asterisk. Damnatio memoria. Asterisk. The condemnation of memory. Imagine this. You live, you rule, you die, and then an entire empire conspires to pretend you never existed. This wasn't just forgetting, it was a systematic, state-sanctioned erasure. And it's the final, dramatic chapter in the life of the emperor we've been following. After his death, a wave of relief, mixed with fury, swept through the Roman Senate. They had endured years of his tyrannical rule, his purges, and his paranoia. Now, with him gone, they weren't content with just moving on. They wanted revenge on his very memory. The decree was passed. Damnatio memoriae. His name was to be struck from all public records. His face chiseled off monuments. His statues, once symbols of absolute power, were to be torn down, smashed into pieces, and melted. Coins bearing his likeness were recalled and It was as if the Senate was trying to surgically remove a tumor from the body of Roman history. Every inscription, every arch, every public building that bore his name was to be corrected. Picture the scene in Rome and across the provinces. Stonecutters are hoisted up the sides of towering arches, their chisels and hammers ringing out as they meticulously scrape away the offending letters of his name. In the Forum, a crowd gathers to watch as a colossal bronze statue is toppled, crashing to the ground with a deafening thud before being carted away for scrap. It was a public spectacle, a powerful message to any future ruler. This is the ultimate price for tyranny. The Senate wanted to ensure that no one would ever look upon his image and be inspired, and that future generations would know him only as a void, a blank space in the imperial line. This was more than just political retribution. It was an attempt to rewrite reality, to control the past in order to secure the future. They were trying to kill his ghost. But can you truly erase a person who shaped an empire? The effort was monumental, but ultimately, it was a paradox. How do you erase someone without constantly reminding people of who you're erasing? The very act of destruction created a new kind of memory. The blank spaces on inscriptions screamed his absence. The damaged portraits became a testament to his downfall. Historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, while condemning him, couldn't write their histories without detailing his reign. They had to explain asterisk why asterisk. He was erased, and in doing so, they preserved his story forever. His name became synonymous with tyranny, a cautionary tale passed down through the ages. The Senate's attempt to create a void only ended up creating a legend of a different sort the emperor so hated. They tried to delete him from time itself. So, where do we see the physical evidence of this today? It's everywhere if you know where to look. Visit a museum with Roman artifacts, and you might see a family portrait of an imperial dynasty with one figure crudely removed, or an inscription where the spacing of the letters is suddenly awkward, revealing where a name was painstakingly chiseled out and replaced, often with the name of a successor. One of the most famous examples is the Severan Tondo, a painted portrait of Emperor Septimius Severus and his family. After one of his sons, Caracalla, had his brother Geta murdered, he ordered Geta's memory condemned. And in the portrait, where Geta's face should be, there is just a haunting, empty smudge. It's a chilling visual representation of damnatio memoriae. These aren't just damaged artifacts. They are historical crime scenes, physical scars left by a brutal act of political and historical vandalism. And this brings us to the ultimate irony of his story. The Senate condemned his memory, but they couldn't undo his impact. The very empire that sought to erase him was, in many ways, the empire he had saved. Before his rise to power, Rome was teetering on the brink of collapse after years of civil war and instability. He, through his ruthless efficiency and administrative reforms, had pulled it back from the edge. He strengthened the frontiers, stabilized the economy, and initiated a period of relative peace and prosperity that would last for decades after his death. The senators who cursed his name walked on roads he had commissioned. The citizens who cheered the destruction of his statues lived in a city he had rebuilt. His legacy wasn't in the stone and bronze that could be smashed, but in the very foundation of the enduring Roman state. He created a system of governance and a military structure that was so robust it could withstand the chaos of his own tyrannical end. In the subsequent power struggles, the empire didn't crumble when he died. It continued, built on the framework he had solidified. This is the great paradox of his reign. The monster who saved the empire. Rome needed his strength, but it couldn't stomach his tyranny. In the end, they kept the stability he brought, but tried to discard the man who brought it. It is a powerful lesson in history, that a person's legacy is often far more complex than the simple narratives of good or evil we like to tell. His name might have been erased from stone, but his impact was etched into the very fabric of the Roman world. The ghost they tried to kill continued to haunt the empire, not as a specter of terror, but as an invisible architect of its survival. So, was the *Domitian Memoria* a success? As a political statement, absolutely. It was a visceral and powerful assertion of senatorial authority, and a warning to future emperors. But as an act of total historical erasure, a complete failure. By trying to wipe him from the pages of history, they inadvertently gave him one of its most compelling chapters. They made him unforgettable. His story is a testament to the fact that you can destroy statues and chisel away names, but you cannot destroy an idea or an impact. The past, no matter how much we try to bury it, always finds a way to speak. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into one of history's most dramatic acts of revenge. It's a fascinating reminder that history is not just what happened, but also what people wanted to remember and what they tried to forget. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the past. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hello and welcome back to our journey through Roman history. Today, we're diving into the complex and often misunderstood reign of the Emperor Domitian. For centuries, the name Domitian has been synonymous with tyranny, paranoia, and cruelty. Ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius painted a grim picture of an emperor who ruled through fear, executed senators on a whim, and demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. But is that the whole story? In recent decades, historians have started to peel back the layers of this ancient propaganda, and a new, more nuanced picture of Domitian is emerging. In this episode, we will reassess his legacy, weighing the traditional narrative of a despot against the growing evidence of a surprisingly effective administrator. Was he a monster, a misunderstood genius, or something in between? Let's find out. To understand Domitian, we first need to understand his background. He was the younger son of Vespasian, the man who founded the Flavian dynasty after the chaotic year of the 4 emperors. Unlike his older brother Titus, who was groomed for power and won military glory in Judea, Domitian spent his youth largely in the shadow of his family. He was kept away from major political and military commands, which likely fostered a sense of insecurity and a deep-seated desire to prove himself. When Titus died after a short reign, Domitian ascended to the throne in 81 AD. The senatorial elite, who already looked down on the Flavians as upstarts, were immediately wary of this untested and ambitious young emperor. This mutual suspicion would define his relationship with the Senate for the next 15 years, and heavily influence the historical accounts written by members of that very class. They saw his assertiveness not as a sign of a strong ruler, but as the arrogance of a tyrant. The traditional narrative, as I mentioned, is brutal. Suetonius tells us Domitian began his reign with a mix of modesty and cruelty, but soon let his darker impulses take over. He alleges that Domitian would spend hours alone, famously catching and stabbing flies with a stylus. This anecdote, whether true or not, was designed to portray him as a man with a penchant for casual cruelty. More seriously, he was accused of conducting numerous treason trials, known as Machestas trials, against prominent senators and equestrians. The atmosphere in Rome was reportedly one of terror, where a misplaced word could lead to exile or execution. His insistence on being called Dominus et Deus was seen as the ultimate act of hubris, a shocking departure from the Augustan model of the emperor as princeps, or first among equals. This image of a paranoid, bloodthirsty autocrat has been the dominant one for nearly 2,000 years. And to be clear, there is truth to it. The end of his reign was certainly marked by increased paranoia and executions, especially after the revolt of Lucius Antonius Saturninus. In 89 AD, Domitian did rule with a heavy hand. However, if we turn our attention away from the high politics of Rome and look at the administration of the empire as a whole, a different Domitian comes into focus. This is where the modern reassessment really begins. Far from being a negligent ruler obsessed only with his own power, Domitian was an incredibly diligent and conscientious administrator. He took a keen personal interest in the governance of the provinces, ensuring that governors were held to a high standard and that corruption was stamped out. He passed laws to protect tenant farmers from exploitation by landlords and intervened to prevent speculative hoarding of grain. Economically, his policies were sound. He revalued the Roman currency, increasing the silver content of the denarius, which had been debased by his predecessors. This stabilized the economy and ensured its health for decades to come. He understood that the prosperity of the empire depended on a fair and efficient administration, not just on the whims of the Roman elite. For the average person living in the provinces, Domitian's reign might have been a period of stability and justice, a far cry from the terror described in the capital. Domitian also saw himself as a great builder, and his architectural legacy is undeniable. He completed the Colosseum, which his father had started, and added the Hypogeum, the intricate network of tunnels and cages beneath the arena floor. He built a magnificent new palace on the Palatine Hill, a structure so vast and impressive that parts of it were used by subsequent emperors for centuries. He also rebuilt many parts of Rome that had been destroyed in a great fire in 80, including the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which he lavished with gold and exquisite decorations. Furthermore, his military policy, often criticized by ancient sources, is now seen in a more positive light. While he didn't seek out massive wars of conquest like Trajan, he focused on strengthening and securing the empire's frontiers. He campaigned personally on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, establishing a more defensible border. Limes Germanicus, these were not the actions of a lazy or incompetent ruler, but of an emperor deeply invested in the long-term security and grandeur of the Roman state. So, how do we reconcile these two vastly different portraits of the same man? The tyrant of the Senate versus the diligent administrator of the empire. The key lies in understanding the sources. Our main literary accounts come from men like Tacitus and Pliny the Younger, both senators who survived Domitian's reign and wrote, under his successors, Nerva and Trajan. The new regime built its legitimacy on denigrating the old one. It was politically expedient to portray Domitian as a monster to justify his assassination and the subsequent damnatio memoria, the official condemnation of his memory, where his name was chiseled off public monuments. These writers were not objective journalists. They were part of a traumatized elite who genuinely feared and hated Domitian for sidelining them and challenging their authority. They focused on his autocratic style and the real fear he instilled in their social class, while largely ignoring or downplaying his administrative successes which benefited the wider empire. They resented his reliance on the equestrian class and his direct, often micromanaging, style of governance. Timodan revaluation doesn't seek to absolve Domitian of his cruelty. The executions, the paranoia, the atmosphere of fear among the elite, these were real, and they are a dark stain on his legacy. However, modern history does demand that we look beyond the biased accounts of his political enemies. By examining archaeological evidence, inscriptions, and economic data, we can see that Domitian was also a highly effective ruler in many respects. He was a micromanager, yes, but this often translated into less corruption and more efficient governance. He was autocratic, but this firm hand brought stability to the currency and the frontiers. Perhaps the best way to see Domitian is as a man who embodied the fundamental contradiction of the Roman Empire. He was an absolute monarch, trying to operate within the fictional framework of a republic. His tragedy was his inability, or unwillingness, to play the political game and placate the senatorial elite, as Augustus had so skillfully done. He ruled like the absolute monarch he was, and for that, the traditional holders of power never forgave him. In the end, Domitian's reign was cut short in 96 AD by a palace conspiracy involving court officials and even, reputedly, his own wife. His memory was officially damned, and the Senate rejoiced. But his administrative and economic policies were so effective that his immediate successors, the so-called 5 good emperors, largely continued them. They inherited a stable, well-run, and financially sound empire, a legacy that Domitian, the supposed bad emperor, played a crucial role in creating. The story of Domitian is a powerful reminder that history is often written by the victors. He was no saint, and he was certainly a difficult and dangerous man to have as an enemy. But he was also far more than the one-dimensional monster he was made out to be. He was a complex, capable, and consequential emperor whose true legacy lies somewhere in the vast gray area between the glowing praise of a builder and the dark condemnation of a tyrant. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the reign of Domitian. It's a fascinating subject that really challenges us to think critically about our historical sources. What do you think? Was Domitian more of a good administrator or a bad tyrant? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the complexities of Roman history, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue making this content. We'll see you next time. Hello, and welcome back to our journey through the annals of history. Today, we arrive at the final chapter in the life of a ruler whose name is echoed through the centuries, often in hushed, fearful tones. This is the story of Domitian, the emperor who feared shadows. As we stand at the culmination of his reign, we are not just looking at the end of a man's life, but at the stark and lonely silhouette of absolute power. Domitian's story is a profound meditation on control, the crushing weight of loneliness that accompanies it, and the elusive nature of legacy. What does it mean to be all-powerful, yet utterly alone? Domitian ascended to the throne in the wake of his revered father Vespasian and his popular brother Titus. From the outset, he was a man apart, driven by a fierce ambition to carve his own name into the heart of Rome. And he did. He was a meticulous administrator, a brilliant financial manager, and a formidable military strategist who expanded and secured the empire's borders. Under his watch, Rome flourished. Grandiose building projects transformed the city's skyline, with structures like the magnificent Flavian palace standing as testaments to his vision. He wasn't just a ruler, he was an architect of empire, a man who sought to mold Rome in his own image of order, discipline, and unquestionable authority. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Master and God. This wasn't mere arrogance, it was a statement of intent. For Domitian, the emperor was the living embodiment of the state, the central pillar upon which civilization rested. To question him was to question the very fabric of Roman society. He believed in control, absolute and unwavering. He oversaw the legal system with a stern hand, ensuring justice was swift, if often severe. He enforced public morality with a puritanical zeal, punishing those who deviated from traditional Roman values. In his mind, he was not a tyrant. He was a guardian, a shepherd protecting his flock from chaos and decay. But this relentless pursuit of control came at a tremendous cost. The more he tightened his grip, the more he felt the world slipping through his fingers. The Senate, once a body of esteemed colleagues, became a den of suspected conspirators. His own family, a source of potential rivals. Every whisper in the palace corridors, every glance from a courtier, was twisted by paranoia into a threat. He built a fortress of suspicion around himself, its walls growing higher with each passing year. Imagine the suffocating silence of those marble halls in the Flavian palace. Halls he had built, filled with grandeur, yet empty of genuine warmth or trust. He famously had the walls of his porticos lined with highly polished Cappadocian stone, not for their beauty, but so they would act as mirrors. He wanted to see who might be creeping up behind him. A dagger concealed in their robes. This is the ultimate image of his reign, an emperor so powerful he could command legions and build cities, yet so terrified he had to watch his own back in the polished reflections of his home. He was a prisoner in a palace of his own making, haunted by the phantoms of his own fear. His reign teaches us a timeless and chilling lesson. Power without trust is a cage. It doesn't connect a ruler to their people, it isolates them. Domitian's desire for absolute control created a vacuum around him. He pushed away allies, alienated the aristocracy, and ruled through fear rather than affection. And fear, as history has shown time and again, is a brittle foundation for any legacy. It breeds resentment, which simmers beneath the surface, waiting for the opportune moment to erupt. The people of Rome might have enjoyed the stability and prosperity his administration brought, but they did not love him. The soldiers, whose pay he increased, were loyal, but that loyalty was bought, not earned, through heartfelt connection. He lacked the charisma of Augustus, the affability of his own brother Titus. He had authority, but not adoration, and in the lonely calculus of power, that distinction is everything. His isolation was not just political, it was profoundly personal, a spiritual solitude that must have gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. As the years wore on, the shadows grew longer. Plots, both real and imagined, became more frequent. The purges and executions intensified as his paranoia spiraled. Senators, generals, even members of his own household fell victim to his suspicions. Each act of suppression only served to deepen the well of hatred against him. He was trapped in a vicious cycle. His fear led to cruelty, and that cruelty fueled the very conspiracies he feared. He was fighting a war against specters, a battle waged within the labyrinth of his own mind. And then the end came. Not on a battlefield, not in a public forum, but in the supposed safety of his own chambers. The final conspiracy was not a grand senatorial plot, but an intimate betrayal, allegedly involving his own wife, Domitia Longina, and members of his palace staff, very people who moved within his inner sanctum. The man who saw enemies everywhere failed to see the ones closest to him. The polished stones couldn't protect him from the treachery that had taken root right beside him. His death was violent and desperate, a frantic struggle in the heart of his golden cage, and with his fall, the dam of resentment broke. The Senate, which had trembled before him in life, immediately moved to erase him from history. His statues were torn down, his name chiseled from public inscriptions, his acts officially nullified. This was the ultimate condemnation. Damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. They sought not just to kill the man, but to obliterate his entire existence from the Roman consciousness. But can a legacy truly be erased? Domitian's story endures, precisely because of the attempt to destroy it. It serves as a powerful symbol, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. He is remembered not as the master builder or the skilled administrator, but as the emperor who feared shadows. His life is a stark reminder that true strength lies not in domination, but in connection. True security is found not in walls and mirrors, but in the bonds of trust and mutual respect. As we conclude this chapter, we fade from the gleaming marble halls of Rome, from the clamor of the forum and the whispers of the court. We are left with a profound silence, a quiet darkness. It's the darkness of a tomb from which a name has been scraped away. But it's also the introspective quiet where history's most important lessons reside. Domitian's reign forces us to ask ourselves, what is the true measure of a leader? Is it the monuments they build, or the trust they inspire? Is it the control they exert, or the community they foster? His life was a tragedy of power, a poignant drama of an emperor who conquered the world but could not conquer his own fear. And in that lonely, echoing silence he left behind, his story continues to speak to us, a timeless warning about the isolating nature of power and the enduring human need for trust. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the life of Domitian. If you found this story as compelling as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the fascinating figures of history. Your support means the world and allows us to continue bringing these stories to light. Until next time, stay curious. And so, our journey through the annals of history comes to a gentle close. We've walked the hallowed halls of a bygone era, stood witness to the rise and fall of a ruler who dreamed of an empire forged in iron discipline. We've seen how his quest for absolute control, for a legacy etched in stone, became a gilded cage of his own making. Thank you for joining me on this exploration, for lending your ear to the whispers of the past. It's a timeless story, isn't it? A man who possessed the power to command legions, to redraw maps, and to shape the destiny of millions. He had found himself a prisoner of his own heart. His fortress was not built of stone and mortar, but of fear of betrayal, fear of failure, fear of the very chaos he sought to tame. In his relentless pursuit of order, he lost touch with the humanity he was meant to protect, and ultimately, with himself. The echoes of his decrees faded into the wind, leaving behind a cautionary tale. As we reflect on his story, we're reminded that strength is not always found in unyielding force. True power often lies in vulnerability, in trust, and in the wisdom to know when to let go. His empire, built on a foundation of control, was as brittle as glass. He feared the whispers in the corridors, the shifting allegiances, the love he couldn't command. He saw shadows where there were none, and enemies in the faces of his most loyal subjects. Each victory on the battlefield seemed only to deepen the siege within his own mind. He won a kingdom but lost his peace, a trade that left him utterly bankrupt in spirit. Think of the life he could have led, one where joy was not a weakness, where counsel was not a challenge to his authority, and where love was not a liability. He might have built an empire that lasted not through fear, but through the genuine affection of his people, a legacy remembered not for its stark monuments, but for its warmth and prosperity. But his path was a lonely one, paved with suspicion and solitude. He surrounded himself with walls, both physical and emotional, until the silence of his chambers became the loudest sound he knew. This story teaches us that the most formidable empires are not those of land and conquest, but the empires we build within ourselves. Are they governed by fear, or are they ruled by compassion? Are their borders rigid and closed, or are they open to the world, ready to learn and to grow? The ruler we spoke of chose the former, and in doing so, he became a ghost in his own palace, a stranger to his own reflection. His iron will, the very thing he believed was his greatest asset, became the instrument of his own undoing. It bent the world to his desires, but it ultimately broke his own spirit. He yearned for a legacy that would defy time, to have his name spoken with oath for centuries to come, and in a way, he succeeded. We are speaking his name now, but we do so not with the awe he craved, but with a gentle sadness, a quiet understanding of his profound and tragic miscalculation. He is a testament to the truth that no amount of power can grant you peace, and no fortress can protect you from the battles you wage within your own soul. He chased a phantom of perfection, a world without flaws, and in doing so, missed the imperfect, messy, and beautiful reality of life itself. It's a story that resonates because we all have our own small empires to rule our careers, our families, our personal ambitions. We all face the temptation to control, to plan every detail, to eliminate every risk. We all know the whisper of fear that tells us to build walls, to trust no one, to rely only on our own strength. But as life is a powerful reminder to choose a different path, to lead with an open heart, to find strength and connection, and to build legacies of love and kindness. These are the empires that truly endure. These are the stories that are told not as warnings, but as inspirations. As you drift into your own dreams tonight, let the echoes of this story fade into a peaceful quiet. Let the lessons of the past be a gentle guide, not a heavy burden. May your own inner kingdom be one of peace, ruled by the better angels of your nature. The great figures of history, with all their triumphs and their follies, are but mirrors reflecting the complexities of the human heart. In their stories, we find pieces of our own. Thank you once again for spending this time with me, for delving into the shadows of history to find a glimmer of truth. I hope this tale has offered you not just a glimpse into another time, but also a moment of quiet contemplation for your own journey. Your support means the world, and it's what allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten whispers. If you enjoyed our time together, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us grow and bring more stories like this to light. Until we meet again, may your nights be peaceful and your dreams be sweet. Sleep well.